Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell.
A university in a large regional center was considered young, so it did not have the same prestige as, say, a pedagogical one. The university had its own professors, library, and published scientific works. And at the university, the first graduating class of students was prepared to work at the university. From this graduating class, the most significant careers were made by two of them. David became rector and Jacob became a professor. He lectured and was adored by the students. David and Jacob had once been friends, but long ago their paths parted. David was married and raising children. He looked older than his years and was constantly overloaded with things to do. His many responsibilities at the university and at home left him no free time. Looking at David, you would never say that he held a prominent position, a short man of slim build. He'd been wearing a suit for 20 years. His wife could hardly persuade him to wear one she'd buy or knit for him. But David was in love with science. His university, when he talked about its development or transformation, his eyes began to burn with a fanatical gleam if it became clear the man was in his place. Perhaps Jacob was hurt by the fact that he was not the rector. After all, he was once considered the most brilliant student in the course. His thesis was later published in a separate book. He could and liked to talk, was artistic and very good-looking. It's time to be in the movies. In short, if it was necessary to represent the university somewhere, including abroad, he would fit perfectly with this very Dimka, who speaks so fast that you can't always understand him, especially if he is passionate about the topic. Now it's hard to believe that up until the fourth year they were thick as thieves. Every summer they went on archaeological expeditions, and if anything, they stood for each other. At that time, none of them thought about high positions. Dimka, however, even now is completely indifferent to titles and regalia. And when he was offered to move to the ministry, he flatly refused. University was his life, very much his brainchild. Jacob once wanted to be an archaeologist too. He spent his whole life on expeditions. Even at the bottom of the sea, he was ready to search for submerged antiquities. But his parents intervened. It was their initiative, defense of a candidate's thesis, and then a doctorate. Their connections played a big role in the fact that his path to science was smooth, without a hitch. Jacob has been lecturing ever since. At first, he was stuffy in the university walls. He dreamed of the old days, the archaeology camp, the digging, the campfire songs. But he was the only son of his parents. Both his father and mother had overbearing personalities, and he couldn't break free for a while. Then his father died. His mother became ill. He realized that he couldn't go far away. He lived alone. He had a beautiful apartment near the university, but he visited his mother several times a week. If she was feeling well, and if she was ill, he moved in with her for a while. So when acquaintances talked to him about marriage, Jacob, laughing, said that he had an old girl on his hands, so a young wife he would not pull. And his wife would not want to share him with his mother, who had such a difficult character. So past the time when he was considered a promising bachelor in the eyes of society. For him, however, that time was over. After all, even now, when he was well into his 40s, or rather under 50, he retained his imposing appearance, artistry, and sonorous expressive voice. Last years among the students did not sparkle, and not a single bright star. Every year there was an inevitable dropout. Guys were leaving. The last example when two students took their documents and got a job at the streetcar depot. There was good money to be made there. Girls got married one after another, took a leave of absence, and went on maternity leave. And those who studied with visible labor got a haul from exam to exam, from course to course. Everyone knew that he was single, and many hoped to screw him. Before, they even argued about who would succeed. Later, the bar was lowered. It became clear that none of the girls, even the most beautiful, will not take to the wedding. But to visit him at home to get credit, it was quite realistic. And there were girls who could tell about these visits, but for some reason they all kept silent. And what happened at the professor's house was not discussed at home. Only Nancy once said, "What a bastard he is." What did that mean? Nancy didn't want to discuss it, and the professor lived his life to his heart's content. A couple of times a year, he would find a companion caregiver for his mother and go on vacation in winter to a ski resort, and in summer to any of the European countries to see the antiquities dear to his heart. When his mother's friends asked her if Igor had finally gotten married, if he had at least had children, the elderly woman only waved away passers-by, and I was completely satisfied with this state of affairs. And as long as she was alive, she wasn't going to share her son with anyone. Kate and Betty became friends by accident. Betty came from a small town. She went to university because she did well here in the regional center. Her aunt lived with her, and Betty settled in. Her house was on the very outskirts of town. It took an hour to get to the university on her aunt's bus. To be honest, there was no time for her niece. She was fighting with her husband. The matter was heading for divorce. At home, there were empty liquor bottles on the cupboard, and the collection was regularly replenished. Her aunt had no children of her own, nor did she have any experience with them, and she looked to Betty for a girlfriend. In the evenings, when the girl was a woman, came to her with another bottle of sweet liquor and 2 glasses. Betty knew that now the aunt would complain to her for a long time about her life, about her husband, and she had to give in and sympathize. It was risky to object, because at any moment the aunt could say go to the dormitory. And Betty didn't want to go there, because the dormitory was really bad. 2 9-story red brick buildings with communicating passages only looked presentable from the outside. Inside there was an atmosphere that showed that the university did not have an extra penny. Ragged walls, elevators that almost never worked. Broken windows in the halls had glass put in, but every now and then they were broken again. The kitchen had 1 stove for the entire floor, so the students kept illegal stoves in their rooms, and the hot water was constantly cut off. In short, only a few students lived in the dormitory from the first year. Until the last, everyone tried to find a couple among the natives of the big city and move in with a friend or girlfriend in normal conditions. Betty tried to study at night, but then she would come to class. Tired in the classroom, she could doze off in lecture, once even hopped and became the subject of ridicule, classmates, and bullying the instructor. He took mortal offense. You see, his lectures make some people drowsy. As a result, Betty had to drop all other subjects and learn only ethnography, to crawl through the session, and the position was difficult. Even a small scholarship meant a lot to her. Betty was raised by one mother, and she could not give her much money. Practically the whole amount Betty gave to her aunt for food, left herself only for travel, and to go to the movies, to buy herself new tights, a common notebook for the lecture. There should have been enough scholarship money to save for all of this. Betty tried to walk more, and once she got lost in an unfamiliar courtyard. She didn't know much of the big city yet, just exploring it. I was attracted to the old ones, and she herself did not notice how she found herself on this quiet street, which literally breathed the 19th century. Realizing that she was lost, Betty began to look around, who would ask for directions. There was a girl about her age sitting on a bench in the courtyard. Betty turned to her and asked, "Where do you want to go?" The girl asked. Actually, Betty had to go home to her aunt. That's why she needed the bus stop number 1. The girl at the marshal in the forehead thinking, "You should go to the highway, but it's far to go there, it's better to go to the streetcar stop." The girl was very beautiful with dark hair around her face. Betty also noticed that the bench sent for now with such a bench is usually used by elderly people who have a hard time moving around. Betty had walked around town a lot this day and now realized she was tired. She sat down next to her acquaintance. The girls got to talking. To Betty's surprise, it turned out that they studied at the same university. "Only I'm at the biology department," Kate explained. "As a part-time student, I couldn't get to the university every day. But when I'm in session, my father drives me." "Do you live here?" Kate nodded at one of the beautiful old houses. "That's our apartment. Lucky you," Betty said. But it was obvious that her envy was light, as they say, white. "Would you try our dorm? The elevator worked 3 days a year maybe. And I live on the 9th floor. I couldn't get up there." Kate laughed. "We also have mice and even rats." Betty chimed in. "Recently a mouse ran right into the middle of the room during the day." Wow, I thought I was having a glitch. I used to live in the wrong place, said Kate, way out in the middle of nowhere. We had mice here first, too. The scariest thing is that they can eat supplies in the winter. Cereal. Then my mom brought a cat. I'd like a cat, too. They won't allow it in the dorms. We're strict about pets. Although I know the girls on the 7th floor have a canary. Well, or rather, kinder, and they call him General Secretary in honor of the head of the group, sighed Betty. The girls chatted. It was only when she started blowing her nose that Betty remembered she had to leave. And you're not around much. You could hear the regret in Kate's voice. If you're ever in the area, stop by. Everyone says college is the golden age. I don't have any girlfriends. Kate rose to her feet, and Betty noticed that she was moving with great difficulty, heavy on the stick. She didn't bother to ask what was wrong. Maybe Kate is uncomfortable talking about it, but the girl explained the oldest injury. Maybe if they had operated right away, it would be better now, but there was no opportunity. My dad keeps threatening to send me abroad. They say they'll do the operation there. I'll be able to fly like a butterfly. Betty sighed, and Kate's dad was lucky too. She'd never even been to the sea herself. From then on, Betty, if she made it downtown and herself to the regional library, she was often needed. She always looked into a familiar courtyard and often stood Kate there. The girls chatted about everything in the world. Betty admitted that studying was not easy for her. She was an excellent student at school, but there were so many new subjects at once. To prepare for seminars, you have to sit in the reading room, work with sources, then at bus stops to catch the last bus. And the scariest thing is to get home in dark courtyards. Even the lights are not always on there. I walk with a flashlight. Where do you want to go later? Kate asked. I'd sooner finish the institute and come home. I only have my mom. I miss her. The other girls don't understand me. No one wants to leave here. It's a big city. So many opportunities. They just want to get married, that's all. You haven't fallen in love with anyone here? Kate asked. None of the boys seem to be paying attention to me. There's this one teacher, you know, the star of the screen. Well, she's hoping he'll fall in love with me. That's ridiculous. What if he does? Kate asked slyly. No. But if you go abroad, you could have an affair with some rich foreigner. Are you that pretty? Betty shook his head. I need to heal first. You know, I don't even think about it. I want to wander through the woods to our southern lakes, Kate said soberly. Her face became dreamy, but she did not continue the subject, and Betty learned nothing new about her friend. It was only during the session in absentia that she was amazed to see Kate, leaning on a stick, getting out of such a familiar car. Did David bring it to you himself? After a moment, she asked. Of course, I'm his daughter. Kate looked at her in surprise. Didn't you know? I never mentioned it. Well, I didn't have to. Yeah, I hardly ever see my dad. He's always away at work. So it's pretty much just me and my mom. Kate tried to walk so that she was as little visible as possible, but she wasn't very good at it. Nevertheless, she passed the session with flying colors. And not because she was the rector's own daughter. Kate studied with passion and had a memory, which in common parlance is called a photographic page of textbooks. She memorized and retold them verbatim. What she regretted most was that she would not be able to go with the other students on the internship. Kate had only to listen to their enthusiastic stories when they returned. Betty was not doing so well. She couldn't pass her exams and was in danger of not being admitted to the exams. She approached David with mixed feelings. First of all, she really needed his signature on the credit books. And secondly, she seemed to be terribly afraid of the professor. But deep down, she knew what that meant. Betty was in love with him. Betty and Lucky. Jacob was in the office alone sorting through some papers. Usually he was always surrounded by students. Betty approached so timidly that if she had seen herself from the outside, she would have remembered a yard dog determined to enter the house. What did you want? Jacob asked. Without raising her eyes, you can stop talking about Betty. The professor looked at the girl ironically and at the same time evaluating. Betty was not bad at all, medium height with a good figure. Golden red, curly hair falling below her shoulders. Her eyes were a big green. The only thing that spoiled her was her unclean complexion. Betty tried to scrounge up the money for a beautician for treatments. But it rarely worked, and it didn't help much. Jacob sighed. "What took you so long?" "It's Friday. Your exams start next week. Until the credits are closed, you won't even be allowed to take the first one." "I know. And why did you do so poorly in my subject?" Betty could have told me that she had her work cut out for her other credits. Jacob was hoping to cheat. He often gave students such a party, handed out assignments, and left the room. But it didn't work this time. "What do you suggest we do?" Betty stood signing that we were, after all, hard to sign, saying something like, "Hopefully next semester you will live up to my trust and get credit, not the exam. It's out there hesitating whether to give a 3 or a 4. Professors know a student's scholarship is hanging by a thread for the next 6 months. One word counts, and that's it." "Prepare and come see me tomorrow," Jacob said. 7 o'clock. "I'll write down the address." This was something Betty couldn't imagine. She just clapped her eyes shut. At recess, she couldn't stand it. Shared a student with me. Immediately learned a lot of racy details. It turns out, only from their course. Several girls have already been to Jacob credits and good grades on exams they received. Annotation that went as an appendix. No one complained. He's a real master. The girlfriend enlightened, almost out of envy. "You'll like it too." Now Betty was sure that getting ready meant putting on nice lingerie. And things like that. She was going to the professor like a bride to a wedding. "Even Auntie noticed you were on a date or something?" she asked. Kind of vaguely answered Betty with a little lipstick. "Look here, I won't let you drive anyone," Auntie warned. And then wished for details. "Who's the boy? Where's he from? Is he from the city or from out of town?" Whether it's serious, Betty said without giving it much thought. Her cheeks flushed. She spritzed herself once more with perfume and grabbed her purse. Late for the cab. She couldn't afford one, and it took 2 transfers to get to the professor's house. How many thoughts rattled around in her head as she hesitated to press the call button. When Jacob opened the door, she was unable from excitement to say even hello. To her amazement, his appearance was far from romantic. He didn't resemble a man about to flirt with a girl at all. He rubbed his face with his hands as he made his way into the living room. My big room was a mess right now. Lena looked as if the owner hadn't gotten her hands on it in a long time. Stacks of books everywhere, some papers, notes on the windowsill. The dust from the TV smelled like a cat. Betty turned up her nose. She wasn't wrong. Her aunt's cat litter box smells just like it. And the creep saw that there was a newspaper with a program on the TV, used it for its intended purpose. Jacob shared. He slipped Betty a sheet of printed questions. "Answer these 2. You'll get credit. While you're studying, call me." Then Betty stayed in the room greedily perplexed and confused. After a few minutes, she recovered enough to think about the assignment. She began scribbling answers on papers. There was no one in the way of cheating. Finishing, Betty waited for a while. The professor wasn't coming. She tried clicking him, but it came out softly, and he probably didn't hear. So she got up and wandered around the house, hoping to find him. He slept in the small room on the couch with a book. He must have thought he'd dozed off for a few minutes, but he fell soundly asleep. The book had fallen on his chest. Jacob himself reminded Betty of a not young boy and began to feel sorry for him. Betty never thought she could pity a man who stood far above her. With the social ladder in mind, one could wake him up or wait for him to wake up on his own. Or leave the note sheets by the couch and walk away, then get credit on Monday. Betty did neither one, the other, or the third. She went to the bathroom, found a mop bucket and a rag, and started cleaning. She moved quietly. Jacob woke up when it was already dark. He'd forgotten about Betty and her test. It was very rare for him to fall asleep in the middle of the day. And now he woke up with a clear, good head. He was glad of that. Now it was possible to dwell on his work until deep into the night. He was writing a book, but he often lacked either the time or the energy to finish the next chapter. The light was on in the kitchen. Betty Bread ate, drank tea, and read her textbook. And for the first time she was interested. Every word seemed significant, and it felt Betty. Remarkably calm now, as if she were truly at home in this large professor's apartment. Tidied up by her hands, she looked up. Standing in the doorway was Jacob. I guess I should have embarrassed and started making excuses. Like, I'm sorry, I've been running the place without you. But instead, Betty asked if you wanted dinner. Yes, Jacob, and it came gradually. The kitchen no longer resembled a warehouse of dirty dishes. The smell of home-cooked food smelled like that of a neighbor who cooked much tastier than Mom and fed Jacob when he was little. I stewed zucchini. Do you have a cottage? Betty asked. He shifted his eyebrows and thought. Some acquaintances brought them. They're obsessed with their dacha. When he had eaten but washed his tea, give me the credit, he said discreetly, changing to you. You have a long way to go home. Betty took the credit as a matter of course. Nodding, she tucked the blue book into her bag. I was gonna clean the windows tomorrow. What time will you be home? Look, I didn't mean to imply that you do the dirty work. You know, messing around in the mud. It's already clean. Betty's not worried at all for some reason. By the window, but where do you live? Asked, she named the most remote neighborhood in the city. Not so long ago, it was considered a village in itself. Where are you going now? Stay here. I'll get you some bedding. You can sleep in the big room on the couch. I'll worry about Betty dropping her chin. Did you get home safely or not? I'm the reason you're late. Betty thought she should call her aunt and warn her. Her aunt's house seemed far away now, as if from another life. She texted her aunt to stay at a friend's house. It's okay. Betty couldn't sleep for a long time. The couch was soft, but it was narrow. And every hour and every half hour the antique clock chimes. So Betty knows for sure it's 3:00 a.m. and she's still awake. She managed to doze off before dawn, but not for long at all. Nevertheless, she jumped up first. I was drinking my second cup of coffee by the time the owner woke up. Saturday afternoon slipped by. Betty was washing the windows and making lunch. Jacob hadn't gone anywhere. He worked in his office. And when there was a break, he and Betty chatted. Betty talked and he listened. That's how I found out how she lived with her mom in her small town, and now with her aunt-uncle, and how she wished her college years would just slip by so she could go home. Are you really going to school? Jacob wondered. Of course, Betty. Raz splashed the ox on the glass in a special liquid and took a rag. I have my favorite teacher there. She's retired now. She's got a workload. You know what it is? 40-odd is more than 2 jobs. It's very hard. Nobody's going to school. I'll be there and Wendy will feel better. And Betty made a soup that made her dizzy even from the smell. After they ate, the girl put the pots in the fridge. I think you'll have enough for 3 days. And then that he looked at her questioningly in front of Varia, that she wiped her wet hands and began to pack. Auntie there was already worried, probably left alone Jacob. He thought about it. Never before had the idea of having a housekeeper crossed his mind. Yes, he often had women over and stayed overnight. But he'd never thought of an au pair. Usually strangers in the apartment annoyed him, but Betty did not. She was easy to talk to and even silent. She didn't need to be impressed. The girl lives poorly. Radha will probably have a part-time job. Why not? Her peers work part-time in cafes and pizzerias as waiters. Hand out advertising leaflets on the streets, and some even work at a gas station. Worse yet, homework is on fire. She'll be excited about the opportunity. And the next time the girl came to him, he said bluntly, if you a couple times a week to clean up, I can pay you so much. How's that? Betty turned pale, then blushed, and then quietly said okay. She came to work neatly, like clockwork. Soon there wasn't a corner of the apartment that hadn't been touched by her caring hands. She was sorting out closets, organizing his closet. God, he didn't realize he had so many shirts and sweaters and vests. All of it lurking in the depths of the chief veneer. And he wore what hung closest. Now his refrigerator was never empty. Returning home, he was pleased to think of the deliciousness that awaited him. Already a month later, his mother, whom he visited, squinting, diagnosed him. You found yourself a good woman, a servant, he explained with a smile. Pay her well and leave her alone. You should dust her. You look like a different person. Jacob so in his mind treated Betty better than well. He gave her the keys to the apartment and had a special card that held money for the household. He let Betty spend it however she wanted and never asked for an accounting, and punished Betty's supreme trust. He remained his own man in front of her. He could doze off, he could work, he could be silent or start sharing thoughts that came into his head. But he was completely incapable of seeing Betty as a woman. He could say to her, "Betty, can't you make a snack tomorrow? Buy a nice wine. I have a friend coming over." He didn't notice how the girl's expression changed, how she bit her lip. Betty nodded silently and disappeared into the kitchen. The aunt didn't know her niece worked part-time. She thought she had a busy college life, sitting in the library, running to the movies to hang out with her friends, or partying at dances. The too tired, silent girl returned home. Now she did not wait for her aunt to call her for a drink. She often offered to sit down herself, and when her aunt poured her a second and then a third glass, she didn't refuse. They say that love changes a man for the better. At any rate, his eyes began to burn. Betty's eyes became tense and anxious, like she'd been waiting for something all along, and she didn't see her friends at all. Not even Kate, whom she loved very much. There was no time to drop in. Christmas was approaching. Betty knew her mom was waiting for her, counting the days until the winter session was over. But Betty invariably managed to make it out for the holiday itself. She and her mom never went anywhere. Like most people thought Christmas was a family affair, and there was never a penny to spare. They set the table for two. Mom cooked a specialty dinner that smelled good. It made the whole neighborhood drool. We celebrated Christmas, local time. We went to bed almost as soon as the concert started. Woke up late. We ate out of the fridge, just like everybody else, and we were sure to shout out money to each other for presents. Betty managed to save up for her mom's gold ring last year. It seemed easy to do without jewelry, but her mother had been used to denying herself everything all her life, and her daughter wanted to pamper her. So Mom bought Betty a set of cosmetics. She looked at it, leafing through the catalog, but she couldn't even think of spending such a sum. This year, too, Betty was going to be going home at least the morning of December 31. Jacob would probably not want to settle for hawkers for the holiday. Obviously, he had restaurants or some new girl planned for the holiday. Betty, not to suffer. It's best not to see it. But just before New Year's Eve, the professor got sick. Usually the flu would hit their town in February and recede in March with the cold. But there was no doubt about it. Jacob had caught the flu. High fever, bone-chunky sore eyes. "Classic picture, sure you better not come to me," said the professor on the phone to his assistant. "Who's after you? What about you alone?" The girl was confused. Still wasn't going to go anywhere. Perhaps he was lying. But Betty imagined the picture of a sick man, who no one needs in the literal sense of the word. No one to pour water for him or call an ambulance if he needed it. All his girlfriends had scattered, of course. She set her lip down. That same day, she called home. "Mom, I can't make it. Don't worry about it, but it just happened. We have an exam on the 27th. So, counseling. The girls and I will study together." "Yeah, well, I can't get away." "You should go to your neighbor's. She'll be glad." The lonely old neighbor also spent Christmas alone with the TV. They'll both have more fun with their mom. On December 24, Betty was unlocking the door with her key, as if nothing had happened. Jacob was lying on the couch, covered with a blanket. There was a glass of tea on the nightstand next to him. The professor looked most unhappy. At the same time, he was very surprised to see her. "But I told you to put it in the corridor and go away. I'm very grateful to you, but I don't want you to get sick." "I won't get sick," said Betty firmly, though she didn't feel any confidence. "I'm inoculated. I'll get you all cleaned up and we'll have a party. I forgot to ask, Christmas tree. You have at least a small, artificial one in the household." "I haven't put one up for a long time. It's only when there are children in the family." "I understand." Betty put her hand on the professor's forehead when the temperature was last measured. "An hour ago. So now I feed you a little. Then we drink a fever reducer. Then you sleep while I clean up the place." Jacob felt so weak. He wanted to obey that, sure to him young voice. He was happy to let Betty take control. By evening, the apartment shone with cleanliness. There was a live Christmas tree in the great room. There weren't many toys, but the lights from the garland created a kind of magical ambience. Betty was in the kitchen, and Jacob, who was feeling a little better, was sitting covered with pillows. He was watching a comedy, eating a red fish sandwich and drinking cranberry Mars. He thought, and that in his time even his mother did not care about him so much, and the holiday was not celebrated honorably. At exactly midnight, the champagne glasses were raised. Everything that Betty had prepared seemed unusually delicious to the professor. The girl didn't let him sit for long. She made sure Jacob drank the medicine, turned out the lights. Only the lights on the Christmas tree remained, and the professor fell asleep so soundly that he was not disturbed even by fireworks and firecrackers under the window. Laughter and shouts of drunken companies that gathered in the yard. Jacob woke up at dawn. It was already quiet outside the window. Even the most stalwart had gone home, and he was as wet as a mouse. He didn't call Betty, but she heard him stirring somehow. She came and helped him to change into dry clothes, brought him a drink, and he went back to sleep in the sound sleep of a man on the mend. Betty was in vain, assuring me that she would never fall ill. The flu had caught up with her, and now it was the professor's turn to take care of his assistant. He's not letting her go anywhere. You want to infect your mom or your aunt? Stay here. I can't get infected. I'm immune. I'll call a doctor and we'll be back on our feet in no time. They ended up spending New Year's Eve together. Jacob helped Betty study for her exams. All moral barriers melted away during that time, and the girl had never felt so happy. The professor, when he saw the gift to the girl, it was a book he wanted to have, but the price made him wave away the purchase. Betty, did you get the inheritance? Saying that, he realized that the joke wasn't quite right. The girl only had her mom, and losing her would be a tragedy for Betty. Well, I was going to say, did you rob a bank just to save up? Betty jerked his shoulder, showing that the problem wasn't worth the attention. Of the money I gave you, you didn't spend any of it on yourself. I couldn't take money from myself to look after you for a fee. She stabbed his shoulder and he hugged her gently. Betty only came home for the last few days of the vacation. She could see that her mother missed her very much and was sad that she would have to be separated again soon. But looking at her daughter closely, she said, "I've never seen you so happy." God willing. Apparently, Mommy was on to something. Aunt Betty said she would be staying with a friend from the new semester. The old woman was pleased. That's right. You'll be better off with a friend, going to classes, dancing, and talking together. And it's a long way from my university to yours. Good for you for making that decision. The only person Betty told the whole truth about the blockade. The girl herself couldn't give herself a reason why she decided to open up to her. Kate was not just calm, serious. There was a kind of inner strength in her. Betty had never heard her friend lose her temper, become indignant. Betty explained the mutilation. Kate had been through too much. Right now, Kate only said you didn't ask what his plans were. No, Betty answered. How can I influence anything? Who am I around him? The corner of Kate's mouth twitched a little. But Betty knew her friend too well to see it as mockery. I think he wants us to go away together this summer. Betty remembered. He said he never vacationed in Russia. He said I should get a passport too. He talked me into leaving uni. What did Betty think she was listening to? I know the story from my father, but I gave my word not to discuss it with anyone. I'm sorry, I can't even tell you. But Kate, please, please, Betty begged. You realize no one cares as much as I do, but I promised. All I can say is if you tell Jacob to go somewhere by the sea where archaeologists are digging, he'll be much happier than he is now. It's like her idea convinced him it wasn't too late. But Betty let her friend's words pass her ears. Kate obviously doesn't get it. Jacob has everything here, an apartment, a job, status, students, an elderly mom who is unlikely to be able to move. In short, the tree has grown all its roots into the soil here. How could it be uprooted in February when spring was in the air and the days were getting longer? Betty realized she was pregnant. Later, she didn't know why she decided to hide it for a while. The fact that she was going to have a child was a joy to her. Everything was going to be okay now. Jacob said himself that his life had begun to change. When Betty came in to sign or not, it didn't matter. But no one had ever given Jacob a gift like she would. She decided to confess to him on his birthday. The pregnancy had been very easy for her. There was no nausea or dizziness. More often than usual, she wanted to sleep, and the smell of peppermint was maddeningly annoying. That's all, and she looked better. Her face, on which she had previously had to put so much abnormal cream, became clean and smooth. She put on a little weight. Her look became calm and confident. Thanks to Jacob, she was now well-dressed and had been out and about more than once. Betty was catching interested glances from men. At the university, she didn't tell anyone about her affair. If the girls noticed that she was no longer rushing to the bus stop to go to her aunt's house in a distant neighborhood, Betty said that she was now living in an apartment. Nevertheless, the affair was soon made known on the course. But Betty behaved in such a way that she was not allowed to ask questions, and gradually the fellow students backed off. No one took Betty's relationship with Jacob as anything serious. Once it became known that Betty was invited to the professor as a cleaner, and the girls concluded that the professor had successfully arranged a free servant, plus intimate services. Very convenient. But of course, none of this would last long. Too plain and unassuming. Betty for a man like Jacob. If he ever marries, then certainly not to such and classmates. Talking to Betty, pretended not to know anything. Yes, the anniversary was far away, but Jacob could not make his birthday go unnoticed. It was customary to bring champagne and hors d'oeuvres to the university department, to treat colleagues, to accept congratulations. And the professor kept the most expensive wine in his office in case of important guests. The rector also stopped by on this day, but it wasn't worth spending a collector's French wine on David. He did not know anything about drinks and preferred a shot of white wine, and occasionally on special occasions. Actually, his doctors had forbidden it. A stomach ulcer. Alcohol was to be avoided. At home, Jacob told Betty, "I didn't want you to bother. Let's go to the restaurant. Everyone will see us." Betty waited for Jacob to say, "So what? Let them look and be jealous." But he reassured her with the wrong words. "It's a small restaurant, very quiet. We'll rent an office. I'm sure no one will notice." Betty put on a new dress, blue, velvet. I guess her fellow students aren't adorable. They'd share one of these. They'd say it was old-fashioned. But Betty wasn't much of a fashionista, even though she now had the opportunity to dress well. She found the dress very pretty, and the pearl earrings she'd chosen for the day were nice too. Before leaving them alone, the waiter lit a candle on the table. Jacob had placed the order himself. He knew Betty wasn't versed in fine cuisine, and the names of the dishes didn't mean anything to her, but he decided to treat a Cinderella. "You're probably wondering why I didn't get you anything?" said Betty, and looking at Jacob with loving eyes. "Yes, I have everything in the world. I don't want you to cut yourself any slack." "Well, let's just say it's not everything in the world. Anyway, I wanted to tell you." She winced for a few seconds, and then he got her news, hung up the silence. And the longer it dragged on, the more Betty seemed to think that something was going wrong in a very different way than she had imagined. Betty softly began Jacob. "What do I want you to do now so you don't think I'm a sneak? Think about it. Let's take this easier. You and I will go, you'll be looked at. I'll pay for everything, and the problem will be solved." He didn't say that dreaded word he wanted to throw words at him, assuring him that it would be painless, comfortable, safe, that everything would soon be forgotten. "Good," he asked with a soft smile, stroking his hand. "Good." She didn't hear her voice. "You realize you have to finish your studies, and I don't need and never have needed babies. Of course it's my fault. I realize that. I'm not denying it. You're too young and inexperienced. So let me atone for it by promising you won't experience anything less than the dentist's office." "You're right, Betty." "Good," she whispered. A quarter of an hour later, she said, excusing herself to go to the bathroom. Near the front door, she turned, ran sharply out of the restaurant, stopped the first car she could find, and gave the address to her aunt. When she showed up at her relative's house, frozen tooth on tooth, with eyes like she had just buried her closest loved one, The aunt froze. Please, please, please pour me your lemon of liquor if you don't have vodka, said Betty. I've collapsed the university, said Betty to her friend. She and Kate sat in the garden on the glass loggia. Kate had grown all sorts of things. It was warm and had 2 cozy chairs. This was where Kate liked to work, sitting under the roofing and green leaves. What do you mean you're leaving? Kate asked, and in her voice Betty heard a metal that she had never felt before. But I can't see him every day, and I have to go. He can't leave a job that's so lucrative. He's the king of God at uni. The students look at his mouth. Exactly. He's not going to go away, Kate said. And you've got nothing under your belt. If you drop out, you'll have to go home. You don't have a university there, you'll be without a full education. I won't have time to study now, where and with a baby allowed in the dormitory. I think the 2nd floor is for families. Now they'll give you a room. Do you know how they live there? Our dorm is in the private sector. There's no mains. Only boiling water comes out of the tap. Can you imagine? Somebody has no hot water, and the dorm has no cold water. The girls are washing diapers, and my hands are red as beads. And to go to uni, everyone knows and whispers. And I hear that whispering behind my back all the time. And I don't think Jacob's gonna let me compromise him like this. If I don't get an abortion, he'll get me out of the university. Kate sat in silence, thinking about something. I want to talk to him, she said finally. What in God's name are you talking about? Betty opened her eyes. Are you threatening to have your dad ruin Jacob's career? If you won't marry me, please don't. I wouldn't marry him at all now, even if he proposed. After he sent me away. He's got a dad of his own, I'll leave him out of it. He's not of this world at all. Kate grinned slightly and gave Betty a very grown-up look. He'll pay off the necessary equipment for the lab, but he'll forget that there's no cold water in the dormitory. Can you believe it, Betty, he eats pumpkin. He loves pumpkin more than anything else in the world and asks his mom to make it every day. He doesn't need no spread. And his favorite shirt has been changed for the 3rd decade. He's used to nothing else. You shouldn't let Daddy be involved in any of your worldly matters. It's ridiculous. Don't worry, Betty. I won't intimidate your Jacob, and I won't ask him for anything. I'm just going to tell my story. What story haven't you told me? No, I haven't. I gave my mom my word that no one would ever find out. And you know I keep my word. But now please give me your Jacob's cell phone number. Maria, Kate's mother, was from Canada. It was a very quiet corner with only one convenience store. We took the bus to the center twice a week. The young people from here invariably left when they finished school. It was a good thing Maria's family had many children. Brothers and sisters made up for the lack of friends. There was someone to play with, to wander in the forest. Maria's parents sadly realized that it was not their chicks who would fly out of the nest, although they themselves were not going to move to the city, and hoped that at least one of the children would stay to brighten their old age. Maria was 16 years old when Kevin, a new man, arrived in the village. But Kevin would have attracted attention in any society. He was a little over 30 at the time. Until recently, he'd been working as a geologist, but then something had gone to his head. As Maria's mother indelicately put it, and he wished to live in the arms of nature, to hunt, to plant a vegetable garden. He wished to eat what he had grown and to drink key water, to be surrounded by forest, birds, animals, and no people. He came to the village to find such a place in the vicinity and settle there. He seemed to be a healthy man, his mother said, as he had to work and work and work. But what's he up to? He's healthy, but his head must be sick. Nevertheless, when Kevin paid those people who knew the area well, they pointed him to a hunting hut far away in the woods. It had been abandoned for the last few years, only occasionally occupied by those who went out with a gun for trophies and came back. Kevin came to like it. The place suited him completely. Absolute silence. A small creek in the neighborhood. The cabin had a stove and the essentials of a table. A few benches. I'm ready to buy this house, he said, only to be laughed at. Who would sell that hut? No one lives there. She settles in by accident. No one will kick her out. Maria knew the place well. There was a time when she and the boys used to play there. It's funny because they have their own house there. But it was always summer, and they'd linger in the hut. Well, if it was just for a few hours. And in the evening they were expected, the house surrounded. But the girl could not imagine that it was possible to stay in this wilderness for the winter. It's freezing out here. The snow falls over my head. If anything happens, I'll try to get to people. She had no idea that her opinion would soon change. There were no guys her age or older in the village. Who could she set her eyes on? Kevin was the first to take notice. And soon the girl fell madly in love with him. At first it seemed innocent enough. Maria helped Georgie to get used to the local area, showed him plants, taught him what was poisonous, what was edible, where it was better to pick mushrooms, where hunting was good, and where it was useless to wait for the beast. She carried him from home milk and bread, bought at his request in the village store needles, threads, and all sorts of small things, and did not notice how the time came when she could not live without Kevin. When Maria told her parents that she was moving into the hut, they were stunned. Then the mother began to live as a schoolgirl's father, and the father threatened to shoot his daughter's chosen one with a hunting rifle. But the girl at that time felt happy and said Alyosha still will not hold on. I'll run away to him. If he lets me go in good faith, I'll visit you, but not. So let's say goodbye for good. Her parents knew Maria's stubborn, unyielding character and realized she would still do her own thing. The next day, the daughter packed her things in a backpack and left, humming her new life. But soon she regretted what she had done. Her parents didn't recognize it. Maria had always been secretive, shared only about the good things, and all the difficulties and sorrows experienced alone. At first, everything went well in the new place. Maybe if the girl had lived in the city before, she would immediately feel the change and be disappointed. For Maria, there was the usual housework. She knew how to cook, sew, do laundry in her snug hut brought coziness. Once a month together with her husband, she came to the village, visited her parents, brought them forest guests. Usually it was Siberian berries or fresh fish. Maria washed in the bathhouse, and no wonder, and the village councils. And the next day she would go back to her forest hut with Kevin. And then winter came. This year it was particularly harsh. It was impossible to walk to the village. There was too much snow, and the young woman spent her days in the small hunting lodge. The stove had to be stoked often. The cabin put out in a flash from all the entertainment, a few books in the counted already 100 times. Maria couldn't wait for it to get warmer, for the forest trails to dry, and for her to be able to visit her own. When she finally reached the village, she learned the bitter news. Her father had died at the beginning of winter, and her mother had fallen ill. Maybe it was because she had lost the man she had lived with all her life. Maybe because she was worried about the fate of her youngest daughter, one way or another. She could not be without medical care, and the older children took her to their home in the city. The native house met Maria, boarded up windows. That same year, Maria became pregnant. Then she for the first time stammered that probably for the first time she should move closer to people, return to the village, get on the register, so that help would be nearby, if anything. And when the child was born, until it grew up a little, you can't keep it in the middle of nowhere. But Kevin dismissed all her plans. He began to assure Maria that she had to rely on nature. Childbirth is a natural process, and everything will be fine. And never a city wife's child will grow up so strong and healthy, as their son will grow up here in the fresh air and healthy food. There was some doubt in Maria's soul. She would feel more comfortable if she could get to a doctor in case of need. But Kevin never tired of assuring her that she was a young, strong girl and everything would go well. Maria only managed to take one promise from him. The baby must be born in a maternity hospital. My mother told me that one time she almost died when my brother Liam was born. It's times like this when you need doctors to be there for you. Kevin promised. However, when it was time to get out of the wilderness, it proved impossible. It was raining very hard. There was nothing to think about to get to the hospital in advance. Maria was worried. Kevin again assured her that everything would be just right, and even though the young woman had to suffer a lot, a strong, healthy boy was born. Maria tried to persuade her husband to make contact with the big land. She would be calmer if the doctor examined the child and said that he was all right, but Kevin refused flatly. Now, in his opinion, The young mother just needed to recuperate. Kevin himself cooked food, fed Maria, was caringly gentle, and she for a while resigned herself to the state of affairs. Now, even in winter, Maria had no time to be bored. Wherever her husband went, she was never alone. The child was with her. The mother was worried that the baby might catch cold. She often stoked the stove, and still the hut was colder than usual. In the winter months, it used to be in her home. But little Vanya did not fall ill. Trouble came in the spring, when the sun had already warmed up, and mother and child spent a lot of time in the fresh air. The baby was crawling on the grass. He picked up a tick, but when the kid got sick, his parents couldn't help him. The boy died of encephalitis. It was the hardest time of Maria's life. She hated herself for not insisting. She had to move with her son at least for a while to the empty parents' house. Kevin took his son's death much more calmly. That's the way it is in nature, he said, natural selection. Only the strongest survive. Encephalitis cures itself without medication. If Jack wasn't meant to be, that was his fate. A cemetery funeral was also out of the question, according to Kevin. You and I know how it happened, but strangers might not believe it. And in any case, they'll blame us for everything. They'll say we shouldn't have raised the child in the woods, that we killed him. Didn't we? Maria looked up with tears in her eyes. No one can forbid us to live the way we think is right. Kevin spoke firmly. Everything will work out for us. You'll see. Maybe if Maria had her father and mother waiting for her, she would have packed up and gone to them. But the people closest to her already lived far away from here. And Kevin constantly insinuated Maria that she had no one but him, that only he needed her. And the young woman agreed to stay. A year and a half later, by the time the girl Maria was born, it was already hard to recognize. Quite young, she looked almost twice her age. Her hands had been chopped off by hard work. Hope long ago disappeared cheerful and sly expression, which before was characteristic of her. It felt so much like her, and it didn't matter that when Kevin went to the village to buy some clothes and groceries, she just waved her hand. Go buy what you want yourself. What if you don't guess the size? I don't care what you bring, I'll wear it. She really became completely indifferent to her appearance, and maybe to her fate. She wasn't expecting anything anymore. Yesterday was like today. So monotonously passed a month, 2 months. Meanwhile, the second labor was easier and the woman in labor was quicker on her feet. The baby she now had was not coming down from her arms. Kevin had hoped for a second time that there would be a son, and when he became the father of a daughter, declared that he would raise her as a boy. Maybe some higher power took pity on the girl and her mother. It is not known whether Maria would have been able to bear the loss of a second child or not. Kevin's assurances that nature does everything right, performing natural selection, reassured her not too much. Little Kate's childhood was not easy. No toys to amuse her peers, no special food choices, no cartoons. The simplest food her father had gotten, and the simplest clothes her mother sewed and gave her a single doll, also handmade. Of course, childhood finds its joys everywhere, and Kate enjoyed fiddling with the horns, spending whole days in the woods and learning the lessons her father had taught her. By the time the children were ready to go to school, Kate could read and count to 100, and she could survive a few days in the taiga even if there were no adults around. But in winter it was hard. It was literally cold, hungry, and lonely. You could not go anywhere from home, especially in the cold. The older Kate got, the more she realized, the more often she noticed that her mother was trying to change her life. All for her sake. A daughter needs to study, she told her father. Come on, you'll get there. You really need to. We'll teach her ourselves. But these schools are full of vices. Children learn one from another, and by the time they graduate, they drink, smoke, and cohabit with each other. I didn't drink or smoke. Mom objected. You're just lucky you didn't get spoiled. And Kate, who's going to get led astray. Sooner or later people will come here. The mother would come in from the other end, and it would be known that the child was sitting at home and not going to school. Will be taken away. Kate will be deprived of parental rights. If you go back and forth to the village, that's how it'll be. You'll complain about life there. Write that your husband abuses you, keeps you in brutal conditions. Then you'll lose your daughter for sure. And if you don't bother people, no one will interfere in our lives. The gypsies live as they want. No one touches them. But we started with Mom, and we're hermits. It's our choice. Her father cut her off. It may be your choice, but it's not ours. Once dared Mom to say, I wouldn't dream of cleaning pots with river sand and wearing Latin. Paid skirt, you don't like it? Her father looked at her intently. Go back to your village, and I'll take Kate and go with her where you won't find us. Not me, not her mom. Kate realized that parting them from each other would be the hardest thing in the world. There was no telling how or when their fate would have changed. But misfortune helped. Her father started taking lion hunting, and at an unfortunate hour, they encountered a bear. And if Mom hadn't rushed out to find them, Kate would have died. That's when her leg was mangled. How her mother dragged her daughter to the village before people Kate does not remember. Her mother told me that she carried her in her arms, that she had made some branches and held on through the roadless area. Lucky she didn't get lost. Only one thing Kate's mom kept saying, don't tell anyone about Dad. Don't talk about Dad to Mom. He'll die out there. He's all alone. Don't tell. Mom kept telling her daughters. It seemed that at these moments she was out of her mind. Father is lying there alone in the taiga, and there's no help for him. Mother must have realized that if he stayed alive, he would never give them peace. So she chose such a cruel way to be free, since fate provided the clue. Kate didn't really care about much else. She was in too much pain, too much blood loss. She was in for heavy treatment, several surgeries. But the doctors said that she would have to walk with a crutch, or at best, with a stick. At the hospital, Kate was looked at as a wonder, as some kind of female Mowgli. And everything around her was so unfamiliar and alien to her, as if she were on another planet. But soon Kate at the treatment center was loved. She never complained, never got cranky. She behaved with rare courage and unobtrusiveness. Mom told me afterward, she was dealt with. Kate really could have been taken away from her. But Mom somehow managed to convey that together with her daughter became a victim of circumstances, that her husband did not let her and her daughter go to people, or she would have long ago returned to her native home. They were not separated. The mother confessed that her husband had stayed in the taiga. She managed to get her daughter out, but not her husband. But she said that she could not specify the exact place. Of course, a search was organized. Kate understood the mother hoped that while the father was being searched, he would die and the mother would not be considered guilty. After all, the bear had done it. A tragic accident and nothing more. However, the search parties found neither the father nor his body. And for a long time it was terribly disturbing. Kate's mother was discharged, and she and my mother actually settled in my ancestral home. Both of them after Taiga Hut. Such a life seemed luxurious in the house, 2 rooms, kitchen, bath, and another kitchen. Summer its own garden with apple trees and plums. Maria was pitied. We helped to organize gas, shared things. And at first, they took out food. Then Maria found a job in the village, opened something like a small canteen. And Kate started to study. She didn't go to school, but a teacher went to her and tutored her individually. She said Kate was barely behind her peers. As sharp as she is, of course, she catches up with them quickly. Maria was worried that Kevin would show up sooner or later. She believed he was capable of anything. The worst thing for her was if he took her daughter away with him. She's a mother, she won't have time to call for help, and she'll lose the girl forever. And then archaeologists came to the village. There was a nearby lake, about which legends were made, as if at the bottom of it lies a flooded city and amazing riches. Of course, at all times there were hunters, and they were recruited. They tried to find something without finding anything. But David, who led the expedition, immediately said that he was not going to look for anything underwater. All these are just beautiful fairy tales that have been handed down from generation to generation. But the satellite map is a different matter. It shows that not far from here in the swamp area, there are the remains of an ancient settlement. That's where we should excavate. The archaeologists brought food with them. But when they had an opportunity, they ate not food cooked on the fire, but went to the canteen. They told about Maria, about her unusual fate. And she paid attention to the young woman, began to ask about her life in the taiga. And there he and Maria did not notice how they became attached to each other. David knew that Maria was afraid for the child, but she had nowhere to go. She had no contact with her family, and he offered the woman to go to the city with him. She refused flatly at first. "Do you need someone like me? You'll have me playing the fool all my life. What have I learned in life? And I have nothing. We're dragging from one paycheck to the next. I only have a daughter, and this is someone else's child for you. How can you love her? Listen to me, silly you say, so she'll be with you. They often call me blessed too. I go to work at home, lock the door. If I forget, they'll mix up the salt and sugar. It's impossible to eat lunch afterwards. I even put my shoes on the wrong foot when I was thinking, and then wondered why it was so uncomfortable for me to walk. So I don't know whether such an uncomfortable husband will suit me or not. And as for Kate, where are you going to treat the girl here? She needs neurosurgery. I can show her to some very good doctors. Maybe they can help. Kate will get a good education and never return to the Taiga." It was probably with this kind of talk that David broke Maria's resistance. She realized that she would have to trust this man completely and, moreover, entrust her daughter's life to him. But he'll get her out of here and never have to fear for Kate. She didn't know why, but she felt surprisingly calm around the absent-minded scientist. But when her mother told Kate that they would be leaving soon, the girl felt real grief. She made friends with the neighboring family, and the older boy Liam became her loyal friend. At 10 years old, you can fall in love, you know, but how else? Kate, however, herself did not yet realize that she was in love, but to go away to distant lands and never see a bone again, it seemed worse than death to her. "Will you write letters to each other?" I persuaded my mother, who, as always, understood everything. David signed with Maria as soon as they came to town, and he'd arranged it so that Kate was considered his own daughter. Like he'd been visiting her mother for years, and now he's finally married. Kate was treated in good sanatoriums, taken abroad. A long time ago, no one could think that this girl was once considered Mowgli. Kate grew up to be very beautiful, except for her leg, which had not fully recovered. Some important nerve endings had been damaged. It would have been a beauty contest, if Kate had wanted it, of course. And if it hadn't occurred to her, and it never would have occurred to her, she still wrote letters to Kostya, who had graduated from the Forestry Technical School and was now in the Army, and did not initiate her relatives into the details of this correspondence. Mom, of course, thought that it was the remnants of childhood friendship, which dragged on for years. Well, let her think so. Kate also didn't dream about her father very often. They were terrible dreams. She'd see him in the woods, lying dying in the snow, or she'd think he'd come and knock on the window, wanting to take her with him. She woke up to that knocking. Of course, Kate had girlfriends when she was in the sanatorium, but all those relationships ended when it was time to leave. But Betty, without realizing it, had become attached to her. Sometimes it seemed to her that when she was a child, they had lived in the same village and had been firm friends. Only then they'd forgotten about it. And now what had happened to her friend, Kate took to heart. She couldn't let Jacob break the laces of life and everything like that. That things would go wrong for the girl, Kate had no doubt. Betty was broken. Kate wouldn't allow herself to break down like that even in her most difficult moments about Jacob. Kate had heard from her father. Her stepfather had been called Daddy for a long time now, and surprisingly absent-minded. David often felt sorry for his imposing, confident friend. Jacob should have had a different fate better. It was not uncommon for his father to say. His parents were forcing him to pursue a career, and he had resigned himself to it. It's hard when a man gives up what he has a calling for. Skate Jacob didn't see Jacob, and if it weren't for Betty, wouldn't have felt any interest in this person. Now that she had a piece of paper with his phone number in her hand, she sat for a while, wondering. What would she talk to him about? It would be ridiculous to convince him that Betty was a decent girl and he should marry her. It's a kindergarten, and nothing good will ever come out of the election, and Betty won't agree to it. Kate, lifted up with difficulty, went to the window and stood for a while, staring wildly out into the courtyard, and then returned to her favorite chair and picked up the phone. Jacob, her voice was not like her usual voice now. It sounded different. It's Kate. Do you remember David's daughter? Yes. Rector. Thank you. Nice to meet you too. I'd like to come to you. Yes, home, you heard right. It's not exactly easy for me to walk, but still. No, you're not coming to me, I'm coming to you. I know the address. Please name a time that is convenient for you. Kate felt her interlocutor's slight confusion, but she wasn't going to make it easy for him and reveal her cards right away. Having made an appointment, she ended the conversation. Jacob was really excited. Betty hadn't come to see him in days. He was no longer lecturing in her class. They had not been able to meet in the auditorium. On the contrary, at the university, she had resolutely avoided him, always in his company. He could not approach her. He felt uneasy. There was no telling what a girl could do. She should have agreed to his proposal. Soon she would have forgotten all about it. The old relationship between them could be preserved, at any rate until she finishes college, and their Betty herself will probably find a suitable groom for herself. She can't not realize there's such an age difference between them. He wasn't going to marry anyone. The second option would have been even better if Betty had disappeared from his life altogether. Both of them had made a mistake, and both of them would try to fix it, erase it from their minds. Each would start living their own lives. Worst of all, if a girl starts acting out on her own out of pride over some private citizen. God forbid something untoward happens. He'll be at fault if she decides to have this child, file for child support. Now, that's just not good enough. So everyone knows he's got a son or daughter growing on the side. Betty will start blackmailing him with the baby. There will be no end to her requests. Jacob knew the chancellor had a daughter, and there was talk of her having some kind of health problem. But what did the girl look like? He couldn't even vaguely remember. She wasn't in his department, and she was a part-time student. Why would she need him? And nothing occurred to him. Couldn't the rector, through his daughter, have asked him to write a letter of resignation? David had never acted that way. Maybe there's a guy in this girl who failed a session and she wants to ask for him. What if she heard from the other students about his former habits, and the girls were willing to pay for an A? He saw her on the intercom. A short, dark-haired girl. Kate, asked the girl, nodded. He opened the front door. He met Kate by the elevator. He had never paid such respect to any of the female students, but still the only daughter of the rector. Jacob is used to being able to charm girls literally from the first words, and now, as they call it, turned on the charm. However, looking closely at Kate, he began to get confused in words. The girl was amazingly beautiful, truly a gift of nature. She did not need to paint her face, resort to the tricks of cosmetics. But Kate acted as if she were the same age as Jacob, an adult without any embarrassment. He sensed her inner calm. He invited her into the living room, offered her tea or coffee. "Sit down," Kate asked, and when he sank down beside her on the edge of the couch, she said bluntly, "I want to talk to you about Betty." That's it. The last thing Jacob realized was that Betty was clearly a former outsider, could be friends with the chancellor's daughter. Was it as sneaky as he'd never suspected? And what was it? He asked, to give Kate a chance to reveal her cards first. Does she know much she wants to achieve money or for him to marry Betty? "I'm taking responsibility for this child," Kate said. There's no way he expected that. Such direct words, and that she would say exactly that. Damn it, how good was she? And he's a sophisticated man, couldn't take his eyes off Kate. "What do you mean?" Those words came easy to me. My mind was racing. Jacob tried to concentrate. "I'm going to make sure that Betty does well. I'm asking you to stay out of it. You've already made it clear you won't marry her. And I'd talk her out of it, to be honest. It wouldn't work if you forced yourself to do it. She'd have spent her life trying to make you happy. And she'd have ruined her own. That's it now. I mean it. Don't touch her again. I'm taking over." Kate got up almost easily. Jacob wanted to help her walk to the door, but she made a dismissing gesture with her hand, saying, "I can do without your help." He only had to stand in the hallway and watch as the door slammed shut behind her. Later that afternoon, Kate had a long conversation with Betty. "Here's what we're going to do. You're moving in with us now. I don't mind. You'll find a spare room and your parents won't say a word against it," she said. "The first thing we have to do is to get you through university. Not to live without your aunt, not to travel every day across the city in a packed bus. We'll prepare for the spring session together. My dad and mom will be happy that I have a friend now. You'll go to your mom's for the vacations. Of course, she will have to go through all this, but still she will accept it in the fall, who gave birth to more than half a year to an academic. Don't take it, you'll be back by the winter session. Nothing, we'll manage. Kate was right. They did manage to get over the hurdle together. But it was because Betty accepted her position that she was not alone. In the evenings, the two of them would sit and talk about everything. As the warm spring twilight descended upon the land, they drank apple juice and made plans. It was here in this house that it was easiest to study. Maybe it was the example of Kate, who herself sat a lot at textbooks. Betty went home after she had passed her classes with honors. Of course, the first days were not easy for her. Both her mother cried and she herself cried. But to Betty's surprise, her mom was the first to pull herself together and started preparing the baby dowry. At the end of September, baby girl Clara was born, and Kate became her red. Kate knew her friend would be back in a few months, but she still missed her. True, she had to worry these days. Maria was facing a complicated diagnosis because of her mom. She told herself about it. My Dr. Daniel's eyebrows are coming together. I hate the ultrasound machine black and white breaks on the screen always hiding something you didn't realize was there. Take a look at this. This is what I do not like, said Denis Vasilievich in the chest at 10 o'clock tumor, and not all of its features correspond qualitatively. He tries to explain understandable kindly, as it is supposed to the doctor of the paid office. She talks about fuzzy borders and blood flow. Later he leaves the terms and exclaims, looking at my faces no longer professionally, but sincerely. Well, don't bury yourself before your time, and add quietly. On Monday you will come to the oncology. You need to take a pension. It will be made urgently. I go out. I remember in the lobby young administrator, describing the account of women waiting in line warm evening behind the open door, the wind plowing in my face. But the whole thing was unreal. It was like through absorbent cotton, and the hand felt like it wasn't my own. I took my cell phone out of my bag. I couldn't call my mom or my sister. I could only call our family doctor, Martin. It was the only thing now, not even a rope, a thread, a salvation. What if there was more to it? Martin, as a musician, has an absolute ear for illness, and they live. My mind was jumbled. I paused, remembering how the words I needed to say sounded. I'm going into surgery. You're going to tell me the truth. How serious is it? A friend of mine used to say when someone got really sick, when you're in trouble like this, you knock on every door and other people will tell you. I got the same disease. I'm the one and only. There's no need to be shy. And they start knocking on your mother's door. The door never closes. He always stands on the threshold, with his back turned to his own life, and sees and treats only those who knock. And now, as busy as he is, Martin doesn't say no. He's just leaving for surgery, and he'll call when it's done and call to see him. There was still life to be lived. The journey home is 2 hours long with a layover. An evening where I sit with the phone on my lap, and what's on the ringer? The journey to the hospital in the late twilight. I realize it's a shame to be so afraid for myself, to walk away from serious illnesses. Children. Fate is ruthless to the unrepeatable. When she was lying in the ward in full consciousness and talking to her mother, the doctor came in and said, "How much can you waste medication? She's already dying. It's time to take the needle out." What am I compared to them? Kate, what's going to happen to her? I mean, she's literally not on her feet yet. 800 hours. 9. 10 o'clock call. Come on in. I'm still in surgery. He's done with the surgery. I know the feeling. No, one wine won't make you as drunk as this fatigue. We're sitting here, 2 ogled men. He's fatigued, I don't seem to be driving, says Martin after the examination. And with these words, I can survive the weekend. But on the day when I have to go to oncology, to find out the results of the function, I'm being absolutely disgraceful. I lie on the couch, stuffed with sedatives, surrey, brandy. I lie there, numb, and occasionally start sobbing. Function finds no cancerous cells in the tumor tube they have to operate. but the prognosis is good. After stressing a few days later, I start to have pain all over everything: my back, legs, joints, fingers, and toes. And even eyelids pills don't relieve this pain. I can't even sleep with my foot on the pillow. Oncology impatient. Doctor, there are two such experienced doctors here. They walk down the corridor swiftly, keeping their heads down, seemingly not noticing anyone. It's only seeming. They may not remember their names, but the case is perfect. Here you are, 3 people with your fingers in the women's dressings. What's your last name? Come with me. I want to watch you affectionately, not only with the seriously ill. Strange, says the doctor, having examined me. I don't. 30 years old watching a woman bruise. 2 centimeter swelling. Would have noticed, do you think? Go to our cleaner, get a third opinion. Otherwise, I shouldn't have authorized you. But the ultimate decision is mine. The ultrasound cleans, finds the tumor immediately, and outlines the breast with a black marker. Before marriage, sensuality is in question. I am taken into surgery. I learn later that I am lucky, that people like me, after 3-4 months of waiting in line, being put in inpatient units, go up to the nurse's office every day and wait hopelessly for another hour. Finally, the nurse comes out. The doctors don't have time for you today. Dismissed. They get up, wander through the wards. Monday, Tuesday, everyone's home with husbands. Children Wednesday. You're lucky. The doctors have half an hour today. 2 of them quickly changed their clothes, took off their rings and earrings to the elevator and me. And you next time lucky literally evaporate, to in a minute already in full readiness to emerge elevator. We are sitting in the anteroom of the operating room. 3 women in line, wrapped in white sheets, right sledding in a Roman bath. There are no Euro renovations here. This is where the tiles fall off. This is where the most difficult minutes are for doctors. On the operating table, you're literally disintegrating. Arms out to the sides and strapped down for anesthesia. I really don't care what it takes, as long as I get a diagnosis. It's nice to have a screen so I can't see. Thank God, the nurse hangs the tape on a special holder in front of my face. The minutes drag on endlessly. The lights go out. And who's gone? Just the nurse. Stand to my side. Don't rush for another hour. We're waiting for the tumor results. Good quality. They're letting me go home. By 8 o'clock, I go to oncology for dressings. There are 20 of us in line. And I, who still has a moral, so amazed and delighted. Shoulder hurts, complains a woman without one breast. This week, 200 cans of tomatoes twisted. Have you already bought underwear? Another woman asks. And what about for 1,100? This is the third. And where did you get it? The fourth greedily asks. Show me. The woman looks around the corridor, is a doctor, a very young guy. I wasn't there. She pulls up her shirt. Here's a beautiful bra with lace all over it. I've got this, and I've got a hallway full of it. Naked. The doctor just shakes his head. But you're good. The doctor can't even see me anymore. I'm a thing of the past to him. I'm not offended at all. He's got 10 complicated cases, 10 rooms, beds in the hallway. Thank him for everything. But why doesn't anyone believe me? Martin asks. I said good quality. I'm not saying that I believe him so much that going to the operation, I touched the wall of his house, as I would lie down in the temple to the icon, asking for help from above. I have known for a long time that God is with him. That's what happened to Kate's mom. And thank goodness everything turned out all right. By Christmas, Betty was back in school. David's help was invaluable. He helped the young mother get a part-time job at the university in one of the departments. There was not much time left until graduation, and Betty's mother said she would take care of the baby herself. Her daughter sent her the money she had earned, and everything settled down. Jacob sobbed with complete freedom. She knew that if she began to decide through the courts, it would be difficult to enter the muddy water. She decided to avoid it. Much later, she found out that the professor had contacted her mom and was sending her money every month too. And as a practical woman, she decided to accept that help. But she didn't say anything broader. It's not easy as it is. And when my daughter graduates from university and gets a job, I'll just save the money the father sends for Clara, the mother thought. David had a crush on her. I think he even dreamed about her. He often thought of her. How sometimes you fall in love in spite of your own plans, calculations, attitudes. But he realized that after everything that was going on, Kate would not give him a chance and sent money for his daughter. Thought that if Kate ever found out about it, he would not look like such a scoundrel in her eyes. The hobby friends graduated at the same time. At Kate's house, they had a feast. As the girl said, only for her own people. Betty in the kitchen tried her best to set the table beautifully. David, Maria, if it wasn't for you, thank you. She stood with a glass of champagne in her hand and tears in her eyes. Oh, don't worry about us. Here's a favor for you. Anything always on Kate's mind. I mean, she's a bright head. And now to go to grad school. Then I'll take her to Germany for surgery. That was the plan. So what? So she wants to go back to where she was born. Liam's back, working where he did hers. It felt like Maria was in deep distress. I'm not saying I'm leaving for good, Kate said quietly, but we must see Kostya and decide together what to do next. We only waved our hands in the heat of the moment. Her old life seemed to her, if not hell, then purgatory, from which she had escaped with great difficulty. And the fact that Kate had decided to return to those parts filled her soul with fear, while Kate was joyful, just waiting for what she had dreamed of all her life. She insisted, and a few days later her relatives put her on a train of places in street. Well then, she tried to cheer up her parents. Maybe I'll come with you for the 1000th time, Mom. No, I'll come. You'll see, and you'll send me to Germany. I will. Mother nodded, trying to smile, but wiping away her own tears. Liam met Kate at the station. They stood embraced for so long that they didn't notice the passengers leaving. And then they talked, interrupting each other and yet understanding each other half-heartedly. And our house is boarded up. I'll keep an eye on it. Don't think about it. If you want, even today you can go in there, and your mom is waiting for the room. She has prepared pies for you on the table. What with the raspberry jam, you'll be picking raspberries soon. She will. Liam laughed. Everything was already agreed between them. So, they would apply this week too. Neither of them wanted to wait any longer. And Kate, having lived in the city most of her life, realized that her place was here and at the university. That's why she chose biology. A job would be found at least as a teacher at school, teaching the kids to love the local nature she loved so much. At home at Liam's, the girl was so cheerful and talkative, as they had not seen her for a long time. The lush pies were good, and so was the flavor. Tea was brewed with herbs. They sat at the table until nightfall, and then Kate slept as soundly as she had in recent years. The air here is a special froth more often, she said. It was a few days after her arrival. The whole family was sitting down to dinner. Kate carried a teacup card and suddenly dropped it. The hot tea spilled over the table into her lap. Liam's mother shrieked. Liam became alarmed. Kate looked up into Kate's face. What's wrong? Are you feeling okay in there? Said Kate, pointing to the window and not taking her eyes off him. Did you see that? What's wrong? The man's face pressed against the glass, so scary, unfamiliar. My God. Liam's mother believed her at once, and the young man ran outside to see who had frightened Kate. It was already dark, and he didn't see anyone. Kate was amicably reassured. Liam's mother suggested that it might have been the Alki neighbor who lived near them. Probably came to borrow money. Yeah, he saw a stranger and was shy. Kate nodded and pretended to calm down, but she couldn't sleep for a long time. She dreamed of that pale face in which she recognized familiar features. No, it couldn't be, of course. Probably her subconsciousness called up in her memory the past appearance of her father. So she had imagined it. Then came the bright sunny days when Liam returned from work. He always took Kate for a walk. It was as if it was easier for her to walk here. They reached the far cellar where it was already beginning to mature. They visited a forest stream. Since the hunting huts did not want, Kate did not want. It has long been in negative condition, standing without windows and doors. There's nothing to see there, Liam agreed. You know how there's nothing to see. Is the house an abandoned barn, or will we be taken apart for firewood? And the hut was quickly taken over. but it's not convenient to carry it far from here. So the walls are intact. If I see this place, I'm afraid I'll hallucinate." Kate shook her head. "You know, I'm much more aware of the past now. I can remember scenes I've long forgotten. How did my mom get me out of there? I can't imagine." Liam hugged the girl. He was much taller. Kate felt his strong arm pressed against his chest. She became calm. She really wanted Liam to tell her that the past was in the past, that she would never meet her father again, that he would protect her from all harm. But Kate didn't ask to be reassured. For too long, she had indoctrinated herself to be strong. You can't spring on the necks of others. Right now, she was trying to keep her cool. She had plenty of free time during the day. And if before she was studying, preparing for exams, now the work was alone waiting for Kostya, and she decided to pass the time by going out, walking without him. She wanted to put what she had learned into practice and see firsthand the plants and animals she had studied at university. Kate now knew the Latin names for the life cycle of Paulus and Hebrew. She felt more at home in the taiga than ever before. Liam was wary of the idea, but Kate's voice was firm. "You know my strength. I won't go away for more than 2 or 3 hours. I need it to make me feel like a full person, not an invalid who needs a companion." In the end, Liam relented, only asking her to be sure to bring her hunting rifles with her. "You haven't forgotten how to shoot. In general, in summer I don't know what should happen to be attacked by a predator in the vicinity of the village. And we haven't seen bears around here for a long time. But as they say, it's better to be careful." He picked up one of his rifles, an old, lightweight one. Kate always took it with her. That time she decided to pick raspberries and hung the gun on one of the branches. Beaten by a racer, she went deeper into the thicket. Time flew by imperceptibly. The bidon was almost full. When someone grabbed Kate's arm, the grip was firm, hard not to rip out the chassis. The girl looked up and literally in the freezing cold was walking to the spot. The same face she thought she had resolved into a nightmare. An overgrown bearded man. "Father." Kate said him, and there was no doubt left. She couldn't even get a word out in response. "I followed you." It was what Mom was most afraid of. And she herself had troll-fit Kate from somewhere. She didn't recognize her own voice. "It got so thin and shaky that your mom thought she killed me. But I recovered, and now I'm far away living there. Skit Cage is abandoned. No one will ever find it. How do you know what I am? So I get out to see people from time to time. You can't do without it. So you and me, we're gonna make it. When I came to get salt and matches, they told me you'd arrived. Your mom didn't want to live with me. God be with her. That's what she left me helpless. I won't forgive that. You can't do that in the taiga. I won't forgive you for separating us. No matter what you say, my blood is still yours. And for that I should be grateful." Kate pointed to her mangled leg. "If it hadn't been for Mom, I would have died out there in the woods. What would you have said then? You bring up natural selection again. If Mom had gone crazy, that would have been okay too. A matter of everyday life that she herself did not notice how in place of fear comes from the Ash's rage. The nation, it seems, is not in. Her anger, once you've lived a little longer, you'll realize there's no place for a soft heart. Life is a cruel thing. You said it yourself. Remember, I don't belong here, and I don't want anything to do with you. Nonsense, Katya. Come with me. See how well we'll live together. We won't need anyone." Her father dragged her by the hand. Kate was definitely transported from a childhood, which she had to obey her father's every whim, when his will seemed inseparable. If she fell now, he wouldn't drag her to his abandoned hermitage. The fear she felt was more paralyzing than he could beat her with. He could let her go now for tomorrow, again devise some trap. He is clever and cunning and powerful. He might choose Kostya as his victim, so that she would have no reason to stay here, so that she would follow him out of desperation. But she had a chance, one single chance. "The bidon," she said. "I'll take it with me. I dropped it there in the cell phone." Her father even smiled. I think that's what Kate saw through his thick beard. "Wait here, I'll get it." I said, "Don't be afraid." "I can't physically run away," Kate said. He disappeared into the bushes and returned a couple minutes later with the bidon, that Kate had dropped and locked up. The daughter stood changing her foot in the stump and leading the guns at him. "Crazy," she whispered for all to see. "You've been dead a long time." The moment Kate pulled the trigger, her own heart stopped for a few moments. They were meeting her at the airport. The plane from Germany was about to land. David, Kate, Mom, and Betty with her daughter in her arms. "You say hello, Godfather," break the horse. Baby in front of Clara, just as long as the flight wasn't delayed. Maria was worried. That's how she got turned on. First the surgery, then these complications. "I'd rather have a limp all my life than go through this." But Liam was with her nonstop, and I think that was a great support for her. And about the surgery, it was a Scooter decision, convincing his wife. "What did you decide?" Maria turned to Betty. "Well, what would you have heard Jacob repenting? Said it took him a while to realize it. He was orphaned without me. Without us, that's us." "So what?" Betty shook the baby on his arm to make the girl more comfortable. "We're going back like this." At this time, it was announced that the plane they were waiting for was coming in for a landing. Yet they couldn't wait to see Kate. Liam was walking behind her with heavy bags, and Kate was looking around in the crowd for her family. And when she saw her family, she waved her hand and walked as lightly as if it hadn't even happened. Past the massive stick of a heavy step, little Clara waved back at her and shouted hello.
Subscribe and click the bell. Damn it. If the grandmother had heard such a dirty expression from the mouth of her pupil, she would have deprived her of sweets for a week and made her wash her mouth out with soap. But since Grandma was sound asleep at the late hour of 0 o'clock, Camille went unpunished, finally having stopped pacing her room. Exactly the beast of the cage called the garden. The young girl plumped down on the bed, complaining about the creaking, shell netted from the mushroom in a pile of plush John, and snuggled into his worn chocolate-colored fur. Silently she cried. How? But how could she have been so stupid? To fall so low? It wasn't her brain that obligingly suggested the flu, though. There's still time before the immediate fall, namely 21:30. The exact time was suggested to her by the dial of the alarm clock, at which she cast a tear-stained glance. It was in that time frame that she was to report to the abominable. Impossible without a heart of the scoundrels. 2. It all happened 10 days ago. Camille was in the school library. She had just returned the books she had read and summoned the help of an elderly librarian who had been plagued by sciatica from the rainy weather. Samara had them shelved. Petty. There was a mocking voice over her shoulder and a school drill. Way rolled. Coolly turned around. Startled. Because of the height difference, she gave the owner of the voice with her nose somewhere in his chest. At armpit level. "No," she said, abruptly, and through clenched teeth, she dropped her gaze. She looked bold and contemptuous. Stephen is the bully of the whole school, a bully and just the embodiment of all male vices. The distance between the boxes left no room for maneuvering. But Georgia, still out of the back, turned around, involuntarily slid sideways on his thigh, and standing on tiptoe, reached up, and just a little more and the book on the lives of the greatest ancient Greek philosophers would be in place. She decided that she would just ignore Stephen, not give him that pleasure. Grandmother, by the way, even in the mind forbade to swear, but granddaughter in the mind to do it to herself aloud. Because it was so, because life turned out to be so, that sometimes she felt emotion, and it was impossible to do anything about it. Camille repeated to herself that she did not care that he continued to stand. Behind him, he must be squinting mockingly, blue eyes so piercing it seemed he could see right through you. A rustling sound was heard. Stephen apparently scratched the back of his blonde head. What unseemly habit! And then he suddenly intercepted the book from her, yanked it out of her hand, and slid it back onto the shelf himself. "I didn't ask for it." Before she could finish, she choked on air, because he immediately grasped her shoulders firmly and turned her around to face him, literally typing her back into the shelf. "I need to talk to you. I have nothing to talk about." Unexpectedly for herself, menacingly raised her voice and immediately remembered where she was, went to a whisper, "Leave me alone." That's how it is. After all you've done, it's no different than teasing. He lowered his voice too. "By the way, you've caused me so much damage. You're a firing squad. Calling everyone up to the director. Losses. Who could even come up with trading answers for tests?" "Businessman," Stephen snorted. "You're a dishonest man. You're a liar. You tell me you're not a gentleman." His hand suddenly moved from the girl's round shoulder to her thin, tall neck. His fingers ran along the edge of the snow-white legs, the collar, the decorated dress, as if to feel and outline the contour of the collarbone. "Is that what it is about you? You seem to dress like a grandmother and act like one. What are you doing?" The girl whispered. Her voice was quiet, barely audible. No longer out of habit of observing the rules of the library, but out of a strange numbness that spread through her body from the places Stephen touched. He grinned, but with only his lips. His eyes were cold. Nothing to do. He pulled away, took a step to the side. And so there was finally some distance between them, an obsession that had subsided. "Nothing to do." Camille gasped for air. Stephen stood with his hands in the pockets of his jeans, on top of a t-shirt with some soccer club insignia and a black jacket. Dry, clearly 2 sizes too big. Despite his tall height of almost 190 centimeters, the guy was not very broad in the shoulders, and was terribly self-conscious about it. But he kept it a secret, of course. Stephen was the storm of the school, elusive and yet a known bully in the neighborhood, but on his half. He was also a repeat offender with a history of being held back in 3rd, 6th, and 8th grades. It was hard to know what was the ugly truth about him, and what was a scary rumor. But in any case, it would be hard to find a person more opposite in qualities and peculiarities noticeable at first sight in comparison with Sophia. And she, like him this spring, turned 18 years old at the very beginning of the season, when the first drop just appeared from the roof. Except that while Stephen looked all of 20, Camille was considerably younger than her age. The principal, the vice principal, handed out in the cafeteria, and some other people cringed at that. They loved to compare them. That's how unlike a schoolgirl is to her peers. Camille's grandmother, Emily, who for 10 years had also been her guardian after the death of her parents, who died in a car accident, and her only relative in the world, took care of her. 2 people from very different eras inhabited the 3-bedroom Stalin apartment. In her working past, Emily taught history and literature. For almost 30 years, she had lived in the far north. Her pension was decent. She had enough to live on, as they call it. However, an outside observer could decide that the life of the grandmother and her granddaughter was peculiar, if not to say very strange. Camille received an exceptionally strict upbringing at home. Grandmother had no doubt that the modern world cannot trust a child. Overmullet, young, stupid creature will destroy the soul, morality, cripple, future. Emily herself kept to herself. She socialized only with a few worthy, in her opinion, people around her age. And if there was someone who had the audacity to say that she treated the child wrongly, that person received such an angry, logically constructed, and reasoned response that he himself was to blame, and in general shame on his head. And in time, the neighbors got used to it. After all, every family has its own rules. Everyone knows that. And since Emily's pupil was clean, clothed, and did not freeze, was always fed in winter, well-behaved, since Emily herself had a reputation for impeccability. For the last 50 years, then with time everyone calmed down, and even Invite a little began to envy. After all, Emily had raised a granddaughter, so she's a golden girl, not at all like the modern kids of the family unit. Just a little lady, not a girl, until 5th grade. Camille was homeschooled, and then she went to school and became a white crow. Teachers, though, praised her diligence and gave her A's. One day, I only got a C for my essay on how I spent my summer. In it, a 6th grader described how she had spent the whole summer reading works on world economics and the history of capitalism. The teacher said that it was very informative, But I would like to know about personal, so to speak, life, impressions, and adventures. Were there only books all summer? Camille then boldly replied that her grandmother has an Alex Schwartz acquaintance. He has an anniversary. He is 90 years old, and he just wrote those very books on the history of capitalism. That's why it was necessary to read them all. And then, based on the results, so to speak, to write a poem and give it to the Jubilee. Everything else is in the background of such an important matter. Selfishness and vanity. If Camille had said this one-on-one, the teacher might not have been angry. But the confrontation happened in front of the whole class. The class burst into laughter, and the teacher gave the girl a C. That C made the girl sick. She got so hysterical, she ended up fainting. We had to call an ambulance. Naturally, the teacher replaced it with a B out of harm's way. But Camille spent a long time pining and telling everyone that she was a loser, since her essays had only gotten a measly C. But it wasn't just the specifics of her studies that made her stand out. She dressed very originally. Naturally, her grandmother was in charge of her closet. It consisted of good new things, except that they were made according to the fashion of the 30s of the last century, and that they were clothes are not the most fashionable dressy styles in that era. Shoes were also selected the most modest. Flat shoes were not a brand. Classmates grew up, became teenagers, young girls. They learned to use cosmetics, went for manicures, had their hair done. Camille couldn't afford any of that. Not that she didn't want to. Sometimes she thought her grandmother was too strict. But then she remembered that Emily had a weak heart and that life in the modern world was not sugared just because of such loose morals. And any rudiments of Charlie's rebellious sentiments were just wheat. Without water, the heat of summer. However, Camille was not one of those dunces who can only be transformed by a beauty parlor. By adulthood, the girl's figure has acquired feminine, soft, and lush in the right places outlines. She had a slightly elongated face with high sharks, straight nose, and wide sensual mouth. Gray eyes dazed, black fluffy lashes, long brown hair no one had ever seen. Tucked otherwise in one of three hairstyles, 2 braids on the sides, 1 braid in the back, or 1 braid arranged in a wreath around her head. Add to that refined manners, shyness, modesty, and a habit of keeping in the shadows of everything bright, noisy, flashy, and modern. And also the fact that almost all her interests and daily activities filter only through her grandmother's opinion of whether it is worthy, whether it is decent. And if some meticulously outside observer were to analyze Camille's exactly outlandish exotic mess, he would easily find in everything the reason why those around her perceived her as a strange person. That's putting it mildly. And only in exceptional cases, such as in clashes with Stephen, who for the past 2 years had increasingly made her the object of his attacks. Light, but offensively barbed. Only on rare occasions did her usual calmness come off, and she began not that she would never be boorish, but would reply sharply and defend herself vigorously. "So you have nothing to do," Camille repeated. "Then go and study, you asshole, or help out in class 3. Someone broke a window. It's blowing. The kids need help." Aha. You're fast. Stephen has his usual smile on his face. "No, you're still acting like a grandmother and thinking the same thing. You know I've sorted out my problems, don't you? I'm not getting expelled. Thanks to Emily. She covered for me with our homeroom teacher. She realizes, if you give her the benefit of the doubt, that yes, Emily, she has 4 kids. She's a kind-hearted, fair person. You don't believe me. You want to bet on the test, and on Christopher will put 5, because his daddy brought her candy and something else. This guy was an incorrigible 2-timer, and no one in the class did not doubt that on the final test in math he will fail. Camille, of course, had heard of the couple, or rather, she had read about them. In some books, they were made by noblemen, and usually it didn't end well. There was no way she'd agree to some stupid bet. But today was not a good day at all. First thing in the morning, the grandmother thought her granddaughter had spritzed her granddaughter with cheap perfume. The girl swore that to grandmother's toilet stable did not go near, but she still made her go to the bathroom to wash off. Then it turned out that the grandmother just thought that in the closet there was a moth, so she put perfume in it. That's why Camille's clothes smelled. The grandmother didn't apologize, and her pupil felt unjustly offended. Then before school, she ran into a store to get tights. It was not a boutique, but a very modest youth clothing store. And this was where she and her grandmother sometimes came in when they needed to buy something that Emily had sewn but couldn't make at all. Usually it was something outerwear. This time one of the salesgirls didn't, as usual, just observe her from afar, but came up to her chest. The girl thought that she probably did so because her grandmother was not with her now, or she would never have dared to approach her. Grandma hated all sorts of consultants and knew how to drive them away quickly. The saleswoman talked about the fact that here our new products arrived. Youth clothes, very stylish denim skirts, and blouses beautiful. Camille glanced at it and turned away. No, even if she herself had been wearing what her grandmother sewed for 2 years now, there was no way she was going to upset her and dress differently. Pity, the girl sighed behind the back of the sales clerk, sharing with a colleague. What kind of savagery is this? How will she live when her grandmother is gone? Will be lost with such an attitude. Generally not adapted to life. No, she'll be left without an apartment or all those who beckon and where only the neighbor's teachers look at. It was hard, painful to hear that. And yet Camille couldn't help but recognize this woman as Evelyn. I saw the name on the counselor's name tags. She's got a point. It was really creepy to think about the time when she'd be alone. Grandma had been talking a lot lately about how she would soon be taken to heaven by her grandfather, and she, Camille, if she misbehaved, she would end her days on the panel. So to prevent that from happening, she must study hard, behave herself, and be a man of honor. What's the bet? Camille blurted out before she could even think about what she was doing. That's a different conversation. Stephen's voice had a sort of muzzled, jubilant edge to it. Let's say if you're right, and Christopher fails, I get the money back that I won in the cleanup card. Camille nodded. That would be very good, just wonderful. Because Borka was a third grader, from a large family, and he'd lost everything he'd saved in pocket money for 6 months, and I'll sign up as a volunteer and go to the city park to plant trees. And I'm not gonna swear. Yeah, I'm in. Wait, he suddenly grabbed her wrist. You didn't even ask what you'd owe if you lost. And what do you want? She opened her eyes with her wrist. How did the burn not hurt? The grip was barely noticeable. It was some other strange perception of his closeness. You agreed to the bet, did you? But I did. You know, I don't really follow you. I don't have to. But I remember you said something in literature class about keeping your word, something about honor. I did. The girl exhaled and tensed, getting ready to pull her arm out, which means you keep your word. And if you lose, you'll come where I say and spend the night with me. Why the squeaky armor? Theoretically, the guy was very clear. Except in my brain, it's like an automatic system kicked in. From the logical decoding of this phrase to spend the night. Why should I come to you for the night? But do not pretend that completely stupid. You understand everything, he said simply. And then he let her go, winked, and disappeared, as if dissolved among the racks. GRU was not left standing, barely breathing. You look in front of you. Oh no. What's going to happen to her now? How could she? How dare he? The girl clapped heavily. Was Stephen not enough of the atrocities he was doing? Why is he with her? For what? Here. And where a librarian appeared in the aisle. Having instructed the polite girl to arrange the books, she lined up for a Michko to drink tea. Oh, why are you so pale? Have you put all the books away? What do you need on the list? Yes, everything, answered Camille. Her thoughts had wandered a long way from the library. Thank you. I don't need anything. And she left quite a bit. From the elderly librarian by the fact that she did not even say goodbye. And then the day of the test came. Christopher sat next to Camille, and she, gently peering, realized that he had not solved the problems and the essence of nonsense. Finally, everyone turned in their notebooks. Camille looked triumphantly at Stephen, who was sitting on the Kamchatka. She had no doubt that everything would be as it should be, that justice would prevail. He would lose. Would he keep his word to her? Would be forced to take the path of correction? Let him promise everything just to annoy her. But in the end, it will all come back to him in a positive way. It will. I mean, it can't be any other way. And then we learned that Christopher got an A, and that's when I really wanted to go under. Stephen found her, or rather caught her just outside the school gates, just grew in front of her, so she bumped into him again. "Hello." "Hello," said the girl and lowered her head to the moon. "What are we sad about?" "That it's not nice to lose, but it had to happen sometime. You can't live your whole life so right and perfect. You judge yourself. Step to the side." She tried to go around, but he wouldn't let her. "So let's not get into any of your notions. Okay, we had a bet. Now you have to do what we agreed. You know, it's kind of funny, actually. If I were you, I'd be anybody else. I'm sure another girl could send me far and wide. But you're not like that. You gave your word, so here you go." He held out a piece of paper. "My father had a cottage in the suburbs. There's no one there now. I'm coming on Saturday night. You're not going to cry. Don't worry, I won't touch you. We'll have a great time. I'll buy you a barbecue." Camille opened her mouth to say that she couldn't come anywhere, because how could she possibly explain her grandmother's absence at night? She didn't even have any girlfriends she could theoretically spend the night with. But she didn't say anything, just bowed her head sluggishly again and wandered home. Stephen left the walls of the school with an ambivalent feeling. On the one hand, he had managed to achieve today what seemed to him to be unrealistic. On the other hand, he felt as if he had gotten dirty in something nasty and filthy. Camille was not like other girls, and for more than 1 year had been for him only an object of interested mocking observation. But then he began to notice things that the others did not see. How good she was always straight back haughtily, but not haughtily. And what a right word for her aristocratic head planting. This girl never gossiped about others, never brought a cheat sheet. It was clear that she didn't live an easy life, but no one heard her complain. She seemed to exist in her own closed, like a soap bubble world. At recess, she'd duck into a book and just go blank. And then one day she's walking by and notices Stephen's in a bad mood. And she threw something like, "No offense," she wouldn't understand. This phrase referred to a conversation Stephen had had about 10 minutes before with his geography teacher, who had reprimanded him in a scathing, yes, personal way, for not done homework, and did not want to listen to the fact that there was simply no time for it, because in the apartment at Stephen started renovation in the bathroom, and he could not refuse to help. In general, she always scolded her students harshly for everything. After her husband's salary, because as rumor had it, the lion's share of this salary he took away to his mistress. So she found someone to vent her anger on, and it was this statement of Camille Stephen that caught her. He did not ask for pity, and no one dared to tell him what to think and feel. He tried hitting her breasts in response, with taunts, but it had all been bypassed. He began to watch her more, and he himself didn't realize how it had turned into an obsession. Yes, that word seemed quite true to him. And Stephen didn't want to do anything about it. Why? After all, apparently, like so many other people, already had a certain idea of him. So why disappoint her? Even if he never had a chance to win her favor in kind. Well, so be it. But he'll get his. Camille was welcomed home. Familiar, adored Smell's grandmother boiled for a late lunch. Chicken noodle soup and fried pies of broken dough with black caviar. But before sitting down at the table at the very doorstep, Grandma questioned Camille about the grade her test was given at school. Only when she was satisfied with the answer did she tell her to fan out and wash her hands. Then they sat down to watch some old Musketeers movie on TV. Then Grandma, even though it was already 8:00 p.m., took the crystal out of the closet. I didn't have time to get through the morning, but it's necessary to do nothing at least in the evening. Hands from labor will not fall off, she said, giving the pupil an apron without on the couch, which was not avoided by any homework. Then Emily went to bed. Camille found herself left to herself. On the dial, the hands were getting close to midnight, inexorably approaching the coming of Saturday. She drew in a gasp of air and threw herself on the bed, closing her eyes. What was she to do? To break his word can be, of course, but hardly for such unfortunate behavior. She will immediately catch karma boomerang. That is, the well-deserved retribution from fate that her grandmother is so fond of talking about. And for some reason, Camille couldn't imagine what it would be like to exist afterwards. Not to mention that this very thing she'd signed up for menacingly sat up abruptly on the bed, then paced the room. Then a curse burst from her lips. Camille was more and more inclined to tell her grandmother everything and let her scold, let her punish. But then there would be a chance to make up her mind. What to do now? Grandma won't leave away. We'll say that, of course, there can only be a negative answer here. Granddaughter. The voice of an old woman in the corridor sounded. The girl flinched. Why is Grandma awake? She can't read minds. I think, granddaughter. Emily spoke in a hoarse voice. Granddaughter, repeated Emily in a hoarse, weak voice of the heart that she ceased call soon. The ambulance arrived on time. The doctor said it looked very much like an approaching heart attack and hospitalization was necessary. Camille was thrashing around, gathering the things she would need at the hospital as instructed by her grandmother. Emily was taken away. Camille returned to the apartment, locked the front door, sank down on the hallway banquette, and covered her face with her hands and sobbed. What a nightmare everything was turning out to be, just a black streak. And at the same time, it was impossible not to recognize that this misfortune allows her to carry out her plans. After all, the grandmother will spend a few days in the hospital, which means that the fact that the granddaughter did not spend the night at home will not become known to her. Frivolous books, erotic movies. This was not on the cultural and educational menu that the grandmother had prepared for Camille. Naturally, the young girl had some knowledge of the relationship between the sexes, and the school program introduced her to the fact that children are not found in cabbage. And yet the girl realized that if she thought about the fact that she had a little more to do, she would simply lose her feelings. Theoretically, of course, in this, there was a plus date canceled. But there was also a downside. She would essentially be betraying her habit of being an honest person. Like today, you lied about being sick of the cutlet, and then you threw them away. My grandmother once reprimanded her, and for some reason that incident was particularly sharp in George's memory. And tomorrow the grandmother narrowed her eyebrows and slapped the very missing cutlets in front of the pupil. Are you going to steal? Or will you run over a man with a car? Yes, on a green light. Grandma, forgive me, please. Choking on tears, asked little Camille, you will not make me finish them. They were in the garbage pails. How smart are you? Emily stroked the girl's head and then grabbed her ear and pulled her from the table. Take them out and give them to the stray cats that live in the basement. Put your hand straight up and throw it down. Grandma, from fear, the girl even stopped crying. We do not have cats living under the house. Only the rats are there. I don't want to. Too late, dear, grinned the old woman. You have to take responsibility for your actions. And if a rat bites your fingers, she said, touching each of the 5 fingers on her granddaughter's left hand, it's your own fault. I'm a sweetheart. I'm ready to love all kinds of you. Even if you were crooked in the face, even if you got D's in school. But if I knew you were lying, I'll know you don't keep your word. You're gonna lie to me one more time. That's how you're gonna get me in the coffin. You won't have a grandmother anymore. You'll go to an orphanage. I'll live off you. After that, 10-year-old Camille realized that she would always be an honest person and would not break her word. To go and give herself into the hands of a monster in human form. Camille chose her weekend most dressy dress, snow white Richelieu fabric, skirt, sun and sleeves, wings. She blocked her hair with a dark green ribbon over the dress, a light green shade, the young green foliage of cashmere. She decided not to think about what would happen until it happened. She decided to take things one step at a time. Gather herself and check that all electrical appliances were off. Leave the apartment and from her home at the bus stop. Take a bus to the station where the commuter trains leave from. Get off the light version of the train. And she was a little confused, but she was given directions. It was to walk across a field. It wasn't scary. There were other people walking there. Some merry company, a grandmother, a vegetable gardener. They were singing songs, and suddenly a strong young voice broke into their old chorus. The grandmother shared with an extraordinary companion, who was so young knew the words of an ancient Schlager, but immediately sang again. And so the whole company reached the dacha community. It was separated from a small village with the funny name of Jersey Pole, where in the old days they used to graze giant herds of cows, and now rare cattle kept by the locals. And a little farther to the south, the village and dachas were described by the river. In the heat of the summer months, it dries up almost to the bottom. "Who are you, sweetheart?" asked one of the old ladies. Yes, that one staggered off. Acquaintances asked to get something, and she waved her hand in the direction of generally towards the forest, not houses. "Well, happily ever after," the old lady said. Figured the girl didn't want to talk about herself. That's fine. Stephen's cottage turned out to be, and indeed, almost by the forest, stood on the very edge of the community, and it looked pretty abandoned. Camille looks like that. What a place to pick for a date. He couldn't ask her home either. She knew he didn't live alone. He was being raised by some distant relative. After Stephen's father was imprisoned for another theft a few years ago, Camille also knew that the boy's father had passed away last year. Then she sympathized with him and even tried to get close to him, to comfort him somehow. A man's grief. Maybe he realized her attention then. Wrong. He was imagining things. By evening, it was noticeably colder, and the girl chose her clothes according to the weather lunchtime. Still sunny and warm. But now it turned out not to matter at all. The fact that the body crept shivering. What was frightening was something else entirely. Finally, it was on the porch and knocked on the door. "Hello," he said, and a look of amazement flashed across his face, as if he was sure she wasn't coming. "Hi," she said, and thought that awkward mutual greetings like this were becoming a habit. And the group didn't want to make any habits with this guy. "Come in." He stepped aside, letting her into the house. The girl froze slowly, as if there was something nightmarish waiting for her beyond the threshold. However, that was essentially what it was. Inside, the house was just as she had expected it to be. It was in need of repair and cleaning. The furniture had been brought in on the principle that it was worthless. The floors were painted a luscious orange. Camille remembered that the same floors had been in her grandmother's village house. She'd only been there a few times, and then Granny had sold it. She didn't have the energy to travel to keep everything in order, and it was too far away to be used as a summer house. But the main reason for getting rid of the ancestral nest was that she needed money for her Camille nurturing. That's the word nurturing Grandma used. By the way, when she wanted to reproach her granddaughter, say, "I spend so much effort, you nurture, and you still manage to just shrink in winter, tear a new dress for walks, refuse to drink fish oil for immunity, do not remove. You put toys." The list of reasons for reproaches was endless, and only having grown up, or rather in 15 years, Camille began to think about the fact that not everything was her fault. Just sometimes her grandmother needed a fight, and the person with whom it could be done at will. She was the only one who could do it. "So, do you want a drink?" Stephen threw awkwardly as he led the girl into the back of the house. "I don't drink." She dropped it and rolled on him warily. "No, I don't. I'm already aware of that. I'm asking about tea. No coffee. No, I'm not asking for that. And you can." And Nastya got the purse handles first. so we switched knuckles. I know I lost the bet, and I keep my word. I'm ready, but can you hurry it up? The last word she threw at him angrily, determined to cross the distance between them. She stood close again, and he could almost feel her breath. So Stephen stared, dumbfounded. I realize I have quite a reputation, but why were you pouncing on me? What was the courtesan used to call these girls of such behavior? You see, it turns out we can speak the same language, and he smirked. Okay, that was an unfortunate comparison. I'm sorry, but what do you think? I jumped on you like a barbarian right here on the doorstep, threatening you without answering anything. Stephen sighed strangely and stepped back, shoving his hands into the pockets of his jeans. It was gloomy in this part of the cottage. The light poured in from the open door on the right, and there were two of them. The long hallway was junked. The living room was junked, or rather the living room was junked, because in principle there could not be a living room in the cottage. Camille was more inclined to the latter, if to take into account the fireplace, which, apparently, had not been heated for 100 years. It was so dusty with some kind of garbage inside, but she was much more interested in Stephen than in the surroundings. On the way here, her mind was drawing the most fantastic, disgusting pictures, and she imagined being at the mercy of a cynical, immoral scumbag. But for some reason it seemed that now she was just a boy who wanted to seem tough, like the bad guys in action movies, but he's desperately afraid of it. So you're shivering and you're gonna sneeze tomorrow. Apparently, the prolonged silence, in which they froze like two exhibits in an abandoned museum, began to irritate him. Come on, I'll put the tea on. Camille doomedly sank down next. What's all this for? What's to make me tea? It's logical, because you touched it. What does it matter if you're going to? What are you doing? A girl ran in. When Stephen pulled her sweater over her head, the guy froze. I rounded my eyes. She took a step back and still had her back against the wall and held her purse out in front of her in a desperate protective gesture. No, please, I'm not ready. A moment later, a scratchy woolen article of clothing flew into her face. Stupid. Hold it. It's cold to look at. Stephen, who remained in a t-shirt, turned his back to her and began to work on the gas stove. Put them on. I'm not peeking. The desire for warmth outweighed the embarrassment of using someone else's clothes, much less a man's, and Camille, tangling in the sleeves, pulled the sweater on. Thank you, she said quietly. So it's unlikely he heard. You know, I'm really surprised you came just to do a word of honor. It's kind of old-fashioned these days. I can't do otherwise, I shrugged, sitting down at the table. And if I were to argue something similar, like stealing something, it would never happen. Camille said smugly. Aha, so it's still within your moral framework. A teapot and a couple of cups were placed on the table. All three items clearly belonged to different services. That's not what I meant to say, the girl muttered. You cheated at all, caught me giving my word before I knew the terms. When he filled the cup, she put her palms around it. Though it was scary, hot, her body desperately needed to finally get a dose of warmth. Okay, I give up. I'm a scoundrel and a molester. But the end justified the means. He smiled and sat down next to me. There's nothing for tea, she asked timidly, suddenly realizing that her stomach protests against the empty drink and lunch and dinner for nervous thoughts, the ground as it was missed. There were chips and a chocolate bar, but I ate them while I was waiting for you. And the euros. Here's half a chocolate bar. He put the candy on the table. I see. For a while there was silence in the kitchen, where a lone light bulb shone, apart from the sounds of tea drinking. What was that? Was Camille suddenly alert? I didn't hear anything, Stephen said nonchalantly. Did I hear something that made you think there was someone else in the house? The girl went cold. No, you're lying. I'm not lying. There's no one here. The boy nodded at the doorway. Beside him, a puppy, a well-fed little thing that looked like a street Bernard sheepdog, peered into the room. He wiggled his nose funny and shook his paw. The first out of lively young curiosity. The second, because the paw was occupied by a screw. Oh, he's so cute. Camille flew off her chair and was at the puppy's side in a flash. Grandma's strict upbringing included, among other rules, one that said no animals in my house, no dogs in the street. They'll chew them up. They'll freeze. Lock-a-me. The puppy was taken aside, but then attracted by the fact that the stranger was wearing a master-smelling sweater, pitched forward. Where'd he come from? When I was on my way here, he came after me at the station. He must have hurt his paw in the street. I swallowed a little. You'll keep him, or else. I have the right now. Unhappily, Stephen grinned. He'll live at the dacha for now, of course. When I leave here on weekdays, so he'll stay with the neighbors. I've already made arrangements, and then I'll take it all to myself. I've decided to rent an apartment. I'm looking for options to bring him back to where I live now. I can't just throw him out on the street. Stephen whistled, calling the dog, but the girl didn't let him make a move. Picked him up in her arms, went back to the table, slightly pulled out a chair, sat down, and placed the puppy on her lap. Billick stated a fact already known to the boy. Pretty as he was, he also reached out to pet him, and their fingers met in a thick laugh. And the laughter must have stayed on the train, because both of them felt a pang, a strange pulling sensation. Camille froze, eyes wide open, watching the guy's face grow closer. "How beautiful are you?" he whispered. The next moment their lips made contact. About the flu, I had read about the miracle of the first kiss, but she wasn't thinking yet how it could be hers, much less envisioning that it could be so dizzying. Like being dropped into the sky with this guy. And while the kiss lasted, she forgot all about the unhappiness with her grandmother, about the fact that he'd forced her into a terrible moral downfall, that she was entirely at his mercy. The kiss was interrupted for a trivial reason, and they realized they needed a breath of air. Immediately, the magic of the first intimacy vanished. Camille's hazy gaze was a dream, and now, instead of sweet tenderness, it read disgust and contempt. And Stephen, in response, immediately looked haughtily mockingly, so looks the winner on the coveted trophy, which has already managed to touch. And now the moment of total possession is at hand. I hate it. The voice didn't waver. The puppy, as if sensing the mood of people, jumped from her lap. Master of the place informed him master and dog kneeled. Somewhere in the hallway, stupid name Camille was now ready to say anything to hurt him. Other more graceful and sturdy expressions. She was still going through her mind. Didn't ask you. Risked the guy. Rising from the table, she shuffled out of her chair upward, weighed down, and did what all sorts of wilderness survival instructors advise against doing under any circumstances. Turned to the top predator in the house behind her back one moment, and he put his arms around her, turning her to face him. Or rather, pulled her to him, so that the fragile girl's hands pressed against his chest. The forces were, of course, unequal, and he in an instant broke her resistance in the loins. The girl was jabbed from the edge of the steel, and she wrinkled her nose, which he interpreted to his own understanding. A girl like you would never mess with someone like me. But still, you think I'd pass up a chance to at least give you a good kiss? Not a chance in hell. She was about to tell him everything she thought of him and his heartless wager, but only exhaled, clenched her eyes convulsively, realizing she was going to kiss again, and immediately opened her eyes. Hearing glass break somewhere nearby, Stephen heard it too, let go so sharply that Camille staggered. It was only because she clutched her fingers to the table to the point of pain that she did not fall that he cut the question short, pressing his finger to her lips. The girl was pierced with fear. It wasn't even a misunderstanding that something wrong was happening, but a pure underlying feeling. What might be called primitive intuition, for centuries guarding man from trouble. Is there someone in the house? Whispered Stephen, and extinguished the light in the kitchen quietly. Now they heard together in the far room of what was on the other side of the living room, the hallway. Someone was treading heavily. More than one person, it seemed. Damn it. Stephen sagged, and Camille glanced at him, wondering how, however, they could express themselves so similarly. The occasions, of course, were quite different. Thieves are thieves, for the girl whispered. That one has nothing to take, and usually climbs up to the cottages in winter, answered Stephen. And though it was almost dark, only the light of the moon slipped sparingly through the window. The girl could have sworn that he turned pale. Gotta get away. Must be summoned, she said. The telephone in that room, he muttered through his teeth and turned to her. It's yours. Camille quietly took her purse from the table. I opened it. I forgot it at home. Stephen waved his hand, whether to mean okay or not. What an idiot. Go on. Get out. Call the neighbors from them. And you asked the girl. The young men were already in the front of the house, and those who had entered it in the middle of the night, judging from the sounds, moved from a room that could be called a bedroom. Beyond the door, a narrow bed was visible. There was a covered veranda adjoining it, and also playing the part of a huge closet. All this Stephen appraised briskly, pondering what to do next. The door to the second room was still open when Camille entered the cottage, and apparently the puppy had gone out of there. And it had even returned. I'll get the master and come out too, the boy replied. No, you can't do that. With an unconscious gesture, she grabbed his arm and pulled him. Go already, fool. Shook her off him, and go already. Saying this, Stephen disappeared into the gloom of the room. Camille clasped his hands together. He is right. She should run and call for help. Why should she get in the way? After all, she hadn't come here of her own free will. And Stephen is not a good man at all. The girl went to the front door, opened it. Luckily, it didn't creak. It was brighter outside than in the house, and already from the porch you could see the warm light, the lights in the houses of neighbors. But at that moment there was a scream behind her. Camille rushed back and again, as if not realizing what she was doing, grabbed something from the stack of boxes, apparently prepared for taking out the change. Something heavy but comfortably lodged in the cramped palm of her hand approached the doorway. Grimly, she cautiously peered inside, and only by an incredible effort restrained herself from shrieking. Stephen was lying on the floor, with some scrawny type bent over him. His long arms frantically groped the guy, as if the legs of a giant spider made to taste his prey. What is it? A second type raised his voice. He was not visible at once, for he was standing at the other end of the room at the exit to the veranda. Nothing, answered arm's length hoarsely, curled into a cough. I guess Mio fooled us. No way. The second type swayed. And Camille, continuing her observation, it seemed that they were both drunk. It's got to be. The kid knows something for sure, but he's being sea-linged. What do you want to knit with? Hold on. I'll look. Camille backed up so she was hidden by the wall. She didn't plan. She didn't wonder how big her chances were. She had almost ceased to realize herself, and there was only one aspiration left. One decision: she can't leave here. That's the way with these villains. The girl could almost physically feel the threat coming from them. They were apparently looking for something, but that was unimportant. The moment the arm-length, chain-linked man stepped into the antechamber of the living room, a cast-iron skillet fell upon him. The blow struck him squarely on the head, and most of the weight of the cast-iron utensil fell upon his shoulder. The stranger howled, then grunted and collapsed senseless. Camille, before anything else could react, Sama rushed into the room and just threw the skillet forward at random. She was lucky. Those who had entered the house had not expected to find anyone other than the boy son of their longtime debtor. So they were confused, but the second guy managed to dodge. He darted into the veranda. Frightened by the attack, he did not rush to the aid of his accomplice, because he did not know who else was here. Stephen moved and began to rise. Stephen ran. The girl rushed to him and suddenly jerked upward hard, helping him up. I told you. The boy dropped his tongue behind his flying tongue and grimaced with pain. The blow of the bandit who had attacked earlier came in the jaw. And judging by the sensations, now it was impossible to do without a visit to the dentist. The villain, who opened on the veranda, had a flashlight with him. Its beam snatched the young men, and they turned around in sync. Accurately caught in the forest clearing by the light of the headlights, young Alyosha, "Ah," Euphali swore and spat through his teeth, a man in the characteristic clothes of a prisoner. "The girl is still light. Where are you standing? Let's run, Camille. It's the end of you." And the convict took out from his belt something that glinted in the cold light of the moon like steel. They were separated by a few meters, 3 or 4 meters. Stephen came to his senses, and together with the girl, rushed to the exit of the room. He was not a coward, but he was not a fool to stay heroically in the house and engage in hand-to-hand combat. The puppy was yapping at his master's feet. He wasn't a coward either, but he was too young. And when they got into the house, he was just too scared. He scrambled under the one who cried his own way. And now, with 2 good acquaintances around at once, he took the risk of getting out. Camille took an extra couple of seconds to bend down and pick up the mala. "How you round your eyes?" Stephen, when they stepped over, or rather jumped over the louse on the floor of the convict. Such a thing he had not expected from his unwilling guest. But all questions could wait. Without collusion, and without wasting any more breath on superfluous words, young people with a puppy under their arm rushed out of the house and dashed across the lot to a neighbor's dacha. They didn't even turn around to see if they were being chased in. Ran out onto the porch for the door drums. "Help. Call the police. Help." The events that followed merged into several long. Later we recall them as if through the fog of a clock. Alarmed neighbors came to the rescue. And soon those who had broken into Stephen's father's cottage in the middle of the night were captured. They were indeed, as Camille had immediately thought, escaped convicts. An ambulance and a doctor also arrived. After examining Stephen, he said that, in principle, it was nothing serious. The jaw was not broken. And that's the main thing. "Young lady, you don't risk it anymore." The doctor turned to Camille alone on such a big guy with a frying pan. "Dashing. But what if you'd missed? I can't imagine. What else was I supposed to do?" Now that it was over, Camille couldn't stop shivering, even though she was drinking the second mug of scalding hot tea. And 2 woolen plaids, given out by surly, unworthy neighbors, were thrown on her shoulders at once. Stephen disobeyed and looked out still into the street, just when the very convict who attacked him biked to the police car. Too bad he had no time to fight back. Stephen spat on the ground and threatened the man with his fist. He swore at the police. Walking with his feet, he rushed into the fight again. But naturally, no one let him. Stephen heard a couple more nasty things about himself and his father. "It's all clear," he muttered. He went back into the house and sat down at the table, leaning over his cup. Then he explained to Camille who it was. It turned out that 2 prisoners had escaped from the very colony where Stephen's father and his cottage were located. They didn't choose it at random. He liked to lie all his life, Stephen said. One could sense that he was both eager to speak out and uncomfortable with his own need for candor. And Georgia also noticed for the umpteenth time that Stephen calls his father he. But in principle, such an oddity was already familiar since the boy's parent went to the colony 4 years ago. Stephen almost never said either father or John. And here he lied, thinking it would add to his influence in the zone. Bitter. The young man grinned. He didn't keep quiet while he was still at home. He lied that there was gold buried in the dacha, which he stole back in the 90s. You can imagine, Stephen usually spoke about his father without emotion. But now, apparently, against the background of the experience, his intonation was combined with indignation. He lied to my little boy that there was gold in the garden. And I wasn't even then. I used to take a shovel and dig joyfully from fence to fence, from where I took strength. And he was laughing. So there's no gold? Camille asked. No, of course not. Yes, everyone was looking for it with metal detectors. About 10 years ago, they rented the summer house to some students. They heard all this nonsense and started to turn the place upside down, looking for it. And there was never any gold. It's that simple. He just couldn't accept that he was no longer the big bandit everyone feared, which he had once lost at cards. Mom left us back then. That's probably why he went completely off the rails. So he created the illusion that he had money. It's just not time to take it yet. What a bastard. Stephen raised his voice. Even before he died, he had time to shoot the whole psycho out there. How do I know that no one else will come here to this El Dorado on the outskirts? I'm fed up. I'm leaving. How are you leaving? Camille was confused. It was none of her business. And if she had the opportunity to go away and never see Stephen again in her life. But a little earlier, before this attack had happened, she would have gladly taken it, and would even have given much for such a gift of fate. But now she could not explain it to herself. She didn't want to get into the intricacies of her feelings, but she just suddenly realized that she cared about Stephen. It was discouraging, made her feel like a bad and spoiled girl. But Camille couldn't change that, even if she really wanted to. And you'll pass your exams. Stephen stretched out his hand and snapped his fingers in front of her nose. Wake up. What exams? What will this school give me? What about getting into the institute? She whispered. Woolen plates. Would they slip off my shoulders? But the girl didn't even notice, declaring them cool. Aha, an institute like me is lost. Nothing in life is ours for the taking. Stephen averted his eyes. No, you're not missing. You don't have to be. It's not like you have to be like your father, or that you have to live your whole life miserable. You can be anything you want to be. Now Camille's voice sounded firm and determined, as if she had to speak to a large audience, such as her own class, and she had something very important to tell them. What do you know about me? Stephen said this in his usual mockingly arrogant tone, but in his eyes he read a different kind of loneliness and lostness, as if he were suddenly alone in the world. Camille knew, in fact, that he was. She could have sworn that this guy didn't have any really close friends, the kind you trust like yourself, the kind who wouldn't let you go to waste. And then a thought struck like lightning. She does. A grandmother is different. A family member. She replaced mom and dad. But it's still different, and she has no friends of her own. Are you right? She answered. And I know the rumors, and what you said yourself. And that's not much. It doesn't have to be more than that. Stephen rose abruptly from the table. Shall we? Can I call you a cab home? And what else? Robert, neighbor and owner of the cottage, intervened in the conversation. He wasn't eavesdropping on the conversation. It's just that he had his own business with Sprouts and in the next room, and he happened to overhear a lot of things. Robert had known Stephen for 3 years. That is, exactly since he had bought the plot. At first he had thought Stephen was a guy, and a felon without 5 minutes. That was how the distant relative of the young man, who had become his guardian, had put it. But then Robert changed his mind. If only because no one in the cottage community and the surrounding villages could not recall any bad deeds in which Stephen was involved. If only because this kid had been seen doing good deeds here and there. He'd helped fix up one grandmother's cattle shed. In the village, he helped to find lost cats of some townspeople who came to the country house for summer vacations. He participated in clearing the pond of all kinds of garbage, and even once tamed a local gang of hooligans when they started molesting the girls' daughters of the owners of the lost cat. All in all, Stephen, in Robert's opinion, was a great guy. He didn't really understand what Camille had to do with him, and decided that she must be his girlfriend. Romantic interest, so to speak. Let's have a show. These seats are enough betting. I'll give you all kinds of stuff. 2 seats. Now we'll arrange the youth. We'll have tea in the morning. Robert waved his hand. And then I'll give you both a ride to the station. It's a deal. Camille and Stephen nodded in agreement. That's how it was done. Glushenko. Finally, you're back. Rushed to the girl looked out of the apartment across the street neighbor. Good afternoon, Jenna. The girl smiled politely. Yes, I slept over at a friend's place. She had already prepared a lie about the fact that this friend had a small child, and she had to go to the night shift. And her husband too. And that's until she gets the schedules just right, looking for friends who will sit with the baby. But the next words of her neighbor almost made Camille faint. I got a call. I know your grandmother well. Jenna spoke quickly. The hospital called. They couldn't reach you. Oh, what a grief. She was in good health, wasn't she? What? What's wrong with Grandma? Camille was leaning against the wall in the driveway. I got the call. So the neighbor was in no hurry to get to the point. Anyway, Emily took a sudden turn for the worse during the night. The doctors were frantic. Oh, what a grief. You're all alone. The neighbor, the grandmother, stretched out. Grandma, she's dead. Camille's hand went to her neck. How hard is it to breathe? It felt like the sky was going to collapse on my head. Isn't it ridiculous just like that? Was she far away from her grandmother in her last hour? No. Why would you think that? Ooh, spit it out. The neighbor waved her hands. Don't you listen to me at all. What am I telling you? You're a fool. I said you're the only one left since Grandma went to the hospital. It must be hard for you to be alone. Anyway, by morning, she was feeling better. And I got another call to say they'd never seen a patient recover so quickly. They said she'd be home in a week. Oh, why are you so pale? It's not even alive, Jenna. The girl shook her head and turned away and began to jingle her keys, opening the door of her apartment. You can't talk at all. The whole neighborhood doesn't like you for it. And she went into her apartment and slammed the door rudely, without even saying goodbye to her neighbor. Jenna stood there with her mouth open. Camille had never allowed herself anything like that before. However, said the neighbor. And then, remembering that she had put in the queen chicken for soup, yes, put the fire on high. Ouch, poked and ran away to her room. Grandma was indeed soon discharged home, and the life of the small Camille family quickly returned to the usual course. But then it became clear that something was changing. Camille often thought of Stephen. They hadn't seen each other since they had parted at the station. The boy said he'd take the next train. In the meantime, he wanted to walk a little longer and think about everything. Sometimes, walking down the street, caught herself looking for him with her eyes. Why? She couldn't explain it clearly to herself. But she remembered what he had said at the station. Before the train started, he'd said he was very sorry for her and apologized for the idiotic bet. I thought I'd feel better if I got you. It only made it worse. He didn't explain anything else, just disappeared. Camille once thought maybe she could find him herself, just go to his house. Maybe he hadn't moved out of his family's apartment yet, but every time he pulled himself away from such pointless stupidity. Then, as the train pulled away from Camille, Stephen gave her a look, then tugged the puppy's leash lightly. Went for a walk. He really had a lot to think about. Time after time, he replayed the events of the previous evening, but not until the strangers broke into the house. When Georgia was still to come, Stephen could not find a place for himself. With his mind, he knew that he could triumph and get literally anything he wanted from her, except that his own recent impudence somehow began to seem like an unworthy dirty deed. And imagining what would happen when the girl crossed the threshold of the cottage, Stephen somehow could not in his own fantasies commit anything obscene. The most he imagined was a kiss. And this indecision, some silly modesty, only irritated him more. Then he belatedly also thought about the fact that, as promised then in the library, can tomorrow theoretically treat kebabs. Pork and marinade were standing in the fridge, but nothing. Now for evening tea, there's no such thing. It turned out quite invited the girl of his dreams cannot accept. The dog pulled sharply on the leash, thereby pulling Stephen out of his thoughts. Ah, no, said the boy. There's some geese grazing out there. Let's not go hunting them. Let's go in the grass over there, you little dog. It'll be like a jungle for you. Let's play. But even fun with Stephen's pet couldn't stop the thoughts from flowing. Only now they took a different direction. He suddenly remembered how many times his father had grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and, giving not fresh breath, said that they were of the same breed and that Stephen's destiny was to be a thief, a bandit, and that at 6, at 8, at 10 he had hated his father like that, fought him off, shouted that he would never do such abominations as he did, and his father would get furious and threaten to teach his son reason. And then, growing up, Stephen began to realize that many people were not ready to listen to him about what he was like on his own. It turned out that many people perceived him as the son of the very thief John from some house. Stephen faced the fact that children were forbidden to play with him. He was looked down upon in the local stores, as if he was 12 years old and all he could think about was stealing. Distrust, contempt. Stephen responded to all of this with muffled resentment. And then other feelings came in. Stephen became hostile to the world. He did not want to be like his father, but he also realized that he was too often seen as a creature in John's shadow, as an extension of him. Stephen grew up a disobedient child. He realized early on that he didn't need to ask about his mother. It was enough for him to have one frank conversation with his father, who told him that she had left him for a new family, where the husband was all right and rich, and where other normal children had already been born. That was enough for Stephen to realize that his mother was gone, as if he was a half-orphan with a living parent. And then it happened that Stephen found an understanding with a group of guys who were considered the main bullies in the neighborhood. Somehow they got together, and it beckoned to him that these guys didn't suspect him of evil. They didn't bully him. Yes, they were not the ideal of virtue, real hooligans, but society with them beckoned. So he couldn't resist. Stephen, however, kept a little apart and did not participate in many of their scandalous antics. He was 16 when the leader of this kid gang said that they were not ready to be with them in everything. They don't need a man for one thing. Stephen stepped aside. Except the rumors about what a scumbag he was didn't go anywhere. They grew like mountain grass, and now he couldn't. And he didn't want to fight them. In fact, he decided it was probably better that they'd be more afraid of him, less likely to hurt him. And for a while it seemed normal to exist like that. But now Stephen wasn't so sure anymore. He was sickened to think that he had no other way but to follow the stereotypes around him. It was to the point of impossibility. Strangely enough, it was since he had started to get closer to Nina that he had been having these thoughts much more often. And after the events of that night, Stephen suddenly realized clearly he really could make his life anything he wanted it to be. It is only necessary to decide and quickly and definitively change everything. Despite the fact that final exams were approaching and free time had shrunk to the value of 0, Camille found a way to get a part-time job on Sundays. It was a lowly occupation handing out handbills to passers-by on the street, and it paid very little. But it was the very first money earned in the life of a young girl. After calculating the income for 2 weekends, Camille made a difficult decision. How scary was it? But it was too late to back out. It seemed to her that she was on her way to fulfillment. She was drawn by some unknown force that was impossible to resist. The first thing Camille did was to go to the pastry shop and choose a cake, a very small 1/2 kilo. But as the saleswoman assured her, it was homemade and delicious. It was a honey cake with a black currant layer. And then she walked into the mall to a familiar clothing store. Camille stopped with a frantic drinking heart at the racks, above which appealing plastic letters folded into discount words. "Can I help you with something?" Camille flinched as the girl counselor approached her. It was the slightly familiar Evelyn. For the first time in her life, Georgia felt so keenly that she looked wonderful. In an old-fashioned dress below the knee, she looked like a scarecrow to herself. "And I'd like to try this on," she said, and pulled the shoulders of the dress. It was a smoke, someone's gray knee-high dress made of knit fabric with a couple of pockets. In front of it, Camille picked it out because it cost $49, and she had exactly $20 left after buying the cake. The consultant looked then at the dress, which was on unusual clientele, then at the dress, then at the shoulders. "You'll excuse me, but may I offer some advice?" She smiled timidly. "We have these leftovers from the last collection." And here, stepping back a step, she pointed to 4 mannequins who showed brightly colored sundresses made of cotton with flowers. "Accepted new collection. We just haven't had time to put these models on sale yet. If you want, I'll bring your size now." The counselor was very friendly. "One moment, please." Camille had no time to say not to worry, but the consultant disappeared and then reappeared. She was carrying 4 sundresses in different colors and in 2 sizes each. And right now, Camille simply did not have the strength to refuse. As soon as these marvelous outfits were in her hands, it was as if a witch's spell had fallen on the girl. As a result, she came out of the examples, clutching a sundress with large flowers of 4 shades to her chest. "A lovely choice that suits you very well." Continued to count Evelyn, who immediately escorted just glowing with happiness customer to the oblique, and there ran S, escorted her partner into the depths of the hall to correct the clothes that had been unfolded all that day. Sam took it upon herself to count her out. "Thank you for helping me choose." Camille smiled. Her cheeks burned feverishly with a blush. "Thank you, Evelyn. Always happy to help update the look," she smiled back. What Camille didn't know was that Evelyn had already looked at her closely before approaching her and realized, because the girl had counted the bills several times, that the budget for the cover was quite tiny. Camille was not aware of the fact that the sundress she had chosen actually cost $250 with all the discounts. "So you owe exactly $50, the consultant said with a nonchalant look. Camille was already holding out the money, but her eyes fell on the cash register display. It showed the real price. Evelyn had hoped the girl wouldn't notice it, but Camille hesitated and looked uncomprehendingly. "It's the old price. The system knocked it down." She found it quickly. "Evelyn, that'll be $50. And seeing that the girl was slow, Evelyn herself collected the bill from her hands and also motioned to her across the counter, rustling a bag of clothes. "Take it, please, and thank you for the purchase." They exchanged a glance, and it was so quick, piercingly clear. Camille was bringing the package to herself, as if not believing in its material, tangible reality. "Thank you." And she walked out of the store. Before the girl who had performed the cashier's duties in the store that day returned to her seat, Evelyn had time to take out of her pocket the wallet that she simply did not risk ever leaving in the staff locker room of the mall, and put the missing $200 for the sold sundress into the cash register. If at those moments there was anyone who would ask her about the reason for such an act, she would not be able to clearly answer what moved her, but certainly not ordinary pity. She simply decided that it was the right thing to do. That it was the right thing to do. The thing was, it wasn't the first time Evelyn had seen Camille in this store or in town. They lived on the same street, and even their houses were close together, window to window. Evelyn was not a gossip, but if you didn't live as a recluse, you'd learn about a lot of your neighbors, and especially about the ones people said were strange. That's how you get to know them from afar, from the words of strangers. Evelyn was acquainted with Emily's grandmother and her granddaughter. Evelyn herself had been raised in a single-parent household by her grandparents. True, not because of orphanhood. Just parents were constantly on business trips or on hiking trips. In general, they lived their own separate from the native child. A rich life. But Evelyn's grandparents were quite modern people, and so for her Camille's upbringing seemed wild. But there was nothing to be done. Evelyn had been married for a long time. It was the 10th year of their marriage. It was a happy union. And in principle, her husband's income would have allowed her to be a housewife. But when son Kevin went to the 1st grade, Evelyn decided that she had enough of her recluse and got a job at this mall, especially since she'd always wanted a job that had something to do with clothes. Perhaps, Evelyn sometimes thought, it was something passed down from her grandmother, who had worked for almost 40 years. It was here in the clothing store that Evelyn had gotten the chance to get to know her grandmother and the flu, and on visits from an old lady and a teenage girl, who then turned into a young and beautiful girl. The whole store, as they call it, was painful to watch because Emily, in her peculiar manner, now and then yanked her granddaughter. "Don't touch the tear. No, you will not wear that kind of work, and it's not made for you. Put it back. I don't spend the money. I decide what you wear." These were the phrases that accompanied their trips to the store for down jackets, seasonal, and other outerwear. The unhappy child was echoed by another salesgirl. "And what will grow out of her with such a grandmother?" Evelyn shook her head. She didn't know what to say. She felt guilty for some reason. They were strangers. It turned out that it was impossible to watch indifferently all these years as the grandmother grows her granddaughter, keeping her as from diapers in a cocoon of strange, frightening, giving a slight madness, care. Was this what Evelyn had done with the Sundress? She suddenly realized that something special seemed to have happened in Camille's life, something immeasurably important that had motivated her to finally break the cocoon. Her grandmother said to Camille, "Let's have some tea." Back home, the girl hastily hid in her room and went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, put out tea pairs from a special ceremonial service, which in general, according to the rules, appeared on the table only on holidays, and on the calendar with magnetic bright squares. It was a very ordinary Sunday. "What's that?" The old lady frowned. "When did you make that speech?" "I didn't bake." The grandmother smiled at Camille and motioned her to the table. "I don't want you to be angry. Okay, I decided on the weekend not to go out, not to the theater, and not to exhibitions, to go to the library. I did a little work." And Camille told her mentor what she'd been doing. "I just decided that soon I will finish school and I need to get some experience, how to work." Emily sat down at the table, very distrustfully looked at the piece of cake which her granddaughter put on her plate. "Grandma, it's natural and it's fresh, it's true. But it is not always possible only to bake cakes. Sometimes you can. And how much did you make?" 100, answered Camille. "How much does a cake cost?" 50. "Where's the rest of the money?" "I'm Camille. I'm starving. My high school asked me to take a photo for the prom. I just said the first thing that popped into my head." And when Granny looked up, aroused blue eyes squinting intently, Camille had no doubt in those moments. She would be exposed now. But here Emily nodded. It used to be customary for elders to be asked what to do. "Oh, come on. What can I take from you? There's no work after school. Are you going to study?" The old woman finally put off the dessert with a spoon and took a piece of cake to her mouth. Granddaughter held her breath. "That'll do," said Emily, and did not utter another word during the tea party. And then she asked to measure her blood pressure and settled down on the sofa in front of the TV to watch a documentary about VDNK. The girl was happy that the cake was met favorably. The grandmother was simply amazed at her good attitude. After all, the last time Camille had brought her a store-bought cake to the hospital, she had thrown it out the window, screaming about how she wouldn't poison herself with palm oil. Maybe today's tea party is a sign of good things to come. Camille, housekeeper on trial, smiled at her thoughts. But then she remembered Stephen again. It seemed an eternity since that unimaginable incident at the cottage. And in all that time she had not seen Stephen. It was as if he had disappeared from her life altogether, vanished into thin air. The only thing that was certain was that he had dropped out of school after all. It was so little surprise to anyone, though. And the vice principal, not hesitating in expressions, prophesied to this bully the most terrible end, like his father. Camille did not agree with her and almost spoke out loud, but restrained herself, for it did not change anything. Who would believe her that Stephen was not really as horrible a person as everyone thought he was? Camille successfully passed her final exams, and finally, the big day of graduation arrived. Grandmother knew in advance that he would wear his granddaughter a dark blue velvet dress, which she once wore to the school graduation. Mom Camille this dress under the black silk sand, now hung on her shoulders, on the door of the platinum closet. But yesterday's schoolgirl, getting ready for her main holiday now in front of the mirror, admiring herself in a very different outfit, that sundress with marvelous lush pink flowers, For the first time, Camille had not put her hair in a braid. Instead, she had twisted it into curls from the evening before. Logic, of course, was not at home, but she used an old folk trick, and the curls turned out with the help of ordinary socks. "Granddaughter, what took you so long? Are you late?" Camille flinched when she heard her grandmother, but the smile remained on her face, and she felt more confident than ever. And with another glance at herself in the mirror, she walked resolutely toward the door. Emily jerked back, and if she hadn't taken her heart pills this morning, she might have had a second heart attack. Because granddaughter, how did she look? Like she's not even her own. That's her Georgian. "Grandma, I love you very much." The girl intercepted the old woman's hands, gently squeezed her cold fingers, wrinkles, and hands. "But I won't go to my mom in that dress. I've bought myself a paycheck. I just can't live like this anymore. Grandma, it's not right." And so they stood opposite each other, the old generation and the young, the closest people to each other, who sometimes could almost read each other's thoughts, and at the same time very different people who belonged to different worlds. But here Emily, as noted lips and chin trembled, eyes darkened, hands withdrew, and sighed deeply full chest. Exhaled through her teeth, Camille hid her hands behind her back, lowered her eyes. "I won't be long, Grandma. I'll just get my diploma, take a picture with the guys in the park, and go home, Grandma." She took a timid step towards the door. "I'll go." "Okay, go," Emily said unexpectedly calmly. "And don't be in a hurry. It's such a young thing. Stop." She stopped when the girl opened the door to the landing. Emily opened the soap box. It was an old ceramic box with roses on the lid. The soap that had been stored in it almost 100 years ago was also scented with roses. Now it was used to store cash, with which people used to go to the store to buy groceries, pay for light, and so on. Determinedly, the old lady emptied the box of its contents. There were about 3,000. She handed it to her granddaughter. "As I recall, we didn't have a prom date, so tell whoever you need to tell. It's not out of favor that they're there to feed and water you. Granny, go already." The old lady interrupted her and waved her hands as if she had chased away a butterfly that had accidentally flown into the house. "Or we'll be late." Camille left. Emily returned to the hall and sank into her favorite chair, arms settled on the windowsills. She closed her eyes. Quietly, the clock flowed from beneath the closed ones. Tears rolled down the old woman's eyelids. But it was a light sadness. It was just a sudden realization that everything had grown up. Her granddaughter, though she tried to keep her from stupidity and temptations of vices of this world. I guess people are right. It's impossible to hide it from young people. Well, it remains, then, to hope only that it will not do any harm at all, that at least a little John in her head was able to put. And then Emily dozed off. Classmates saw Camille in the update, but the main thing in unusual such a form did not immediately recognize who was in front of them. For a while the cheerfulness died down and all eyes were fixed on the one who had come. Some of the guys whistled, and many girls looked at her with envy. It turned out that this girl had a gorgeous figure, and her hair was usually hidden in tight braids. Now she had lush silk curls. Camille. Anatoly Vladimirovich, the headmaster, approached the girl. "Are you gorgeous?" He simply spread his hands. I wouldn't be lying if I said that I had never seen a more beautiful graduate in my memory. Much later, looking back on that day, Camille understood that its bright events merged in the end into one long action, like multicolored glasses in a kaleidoscope are folded into one pattern. But this was true of the day until the moment when, after a walk in the park, a familiar voice suddenly called out to her. The sun was already slanting toward sunset. Its fiery golden rays penetrated the green of the trees and still blinded. So Camille squinted, and the silhouette of the guy standing nearby turned out to be quite blurred. "Stephen disbelieving," she said. The rest of the graduates didn't even notice her slipping away. Their first impressions had time to dissipate, and they were more interested in each other's company, leaving the oddly familiar to their high school roommate. As in years past to herself, Stephen stood at the entrance to the park, again in ripped jeans. But the jacket was a new brownish red and true to size. "Congratulations," he said and smiled. "Did you drop out of school after all?" the girl said reproachfully, although when she almost ran towards him, she wanted to say something else. "Busy. I had an apartment to sell and a summer house." He glanced from top to bottom and smirked back. "You're pretty, aren't you? Well, I'll leave you to it." He nodded at the group of school children in the distance. "I don't mind," Camille replied. "I guess I don't fit in after all." "You don't have to," said Stephen. "You'll find people you feel comfortable with." It was a strange word, and a phrase for him in general. Camille squinted. "So you've decided to leave after all?" "I have to find my place somewhere." "Okay." He clearly wanted to say something else, but he faltered and retreated a step. "Good luck, Camille." I didn't get a chance to say what I wanted to say. What do they need to talk about? That he's not completely alone. That she has to understand, just has to find out how to help him and... But all these thoughts were born in her mind. She couldn't put it all out coherently right now. She could only stare at him. How she needed him to take the tiniest step towards the tiniest drop himself. But he sent her a mesmerizing stare instead. His face contorted stiffly. And he, turning around, simply rushed to run to the bus stop. A shuttle bus stopped there, and at the same time it seemed painfully clear that he was not just rushing toward the shuttle bus, but that he was running away from it, and from the conversation that could have taken place between them. Figures of swans surrounded by live snowy white hyacinth with flecks of icy pink. And we were beautiful. And if the organizers of this wedding reception had been asked to name the most successful element of the banquet decorations imposed, she would have pointed to these ice sculptures, rhythmically nodding a mini pen on the spread of a notebook, the entries in which were such small abbreviations that only their creator was able to decipher it. The girl looked at her creation magnificently. Thanks to this order, she would finally close the mortgage for the apartment. And also, perhaps, after it I can treat myself to a vacation, in which I have not been for the last 2 years, with a satisfied sigh and a nod to her own reflection. Camille returned the writing utensils to the pocket of an immaculately modest-tailored, smoke-something gray. The jacket that made up the set with a pencil skirt, plus the silk blouse of a delicate lavender hue, was stylish but not overly dressy. After all, she is a responsible person here, and in no case should not compete with the bride or even the guests. "Guys, this way." There was a voice behind her through the open door. Camille's eyes widened. Some workers with a stepladder and some other guy in a black suit entered the room. "Over there." The guy stretched out, pointing at the wall. More precisely, on that part of it, which was located behind the seats for the young and was generously traumatized with silk and spoil, the folds of which were supported by golden Cupid figures. "Hey, what are you doing?" Resentment flooded in. "Trespassing on her domain." "Girl, don't you dare touch anything here." The workers stopped and turned to their superiors, and the superiors to her security detail. Through a tall brunette and stuck his thumbs behind the belt of his pants smirked. It came out extremely cocky. "We're working. Please do not interfere. Do not interfere," indignantly flashed Camille. "Yes, do you know how long we've been laying this down? What do you think you're doing? Why didn't I do anything?" And then she was silent, because the young man's face seemed familiar. Stephen. Apparently, the mutual recognition came to them synchronously. "Camille," he said, "what are you doing here? A wedding?" She answered simply and, in general, quite matter-of-factly. "What are you doing here?" "I'm working too," he said. "So what are we doing?" asked one of the workers. "Yes. Wait, you." Stephen brushed it off and focused his attention back on the young woman in front of him. He had remembered her all these years, while he had been busy putting his life back together in a shard. And she remembered him too often, more often than he would have liked to remember a guy he knew from high school, not even a classmate. A close encounter that had taken place under less than romantic circumstances, but that had been in the past. And now they exchanged a few more phrases, and it turned out that Stephen was the head of security of David's fiance's father, a complicated man, a businessman, and even an oligarch. Stephen had spent almost all these years in other parts of the world, and then to work in a solid reputation in the security industry, decided to return to the city, which still considered the most native place. And this is where he eventually found his best job. I never would have guessed, Camille said frankly, when Stephen told her what he was doing. Well, of course, with my pedigree and track record, he replied. And it was not clear whether he was really offended or whether he was being kindly ironic about himself. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. Camille immediately fell into confusion. It's okay, it's so familiar. It's like all those years of separation never happened. Stephen smirked. And you, then, are the creator of all this. He circled the space with his hand. It's pretty, but of course, terribly girly, if you know what I mean. Not at all. Camille had always been very sensitive to criticism of her creations. She could only speak calmly about anything and everything directly to her clients. But the rest of us would be better off holding our tongues. Camille herself often regretted her temper, but found a reason for it. Apparently, it was inherited from her grandmother's temper. And the decoration is created taking into account the tastes and wishes of the bride and groom. Our agency is oriented on the current world trends in the field of wedding fashion, said the girl. Wait a minute, you bowed your head. What, you're married and you're doing things with your husband? Do you think that's the only way to do it? Did Camille frown again? No, it just occurred to me. He scratched the back of his head in a familiar gesture. I'm not married. That's wonderful. What do you mean? Never mind. So you started an agency with someone else, and you do weddings? Mostly them. But we also do wedding anniversaries, engagements. Do you do divorces? No. Camille was in such a weird state of mind talking to Stephen that she missed the ringing of her cell phone. The girl carried 2 miniature smartphones with her. The second one contained only personal contacts. And before, such a neglectful part to her professional duties was not peculiar to her. Who would ever think of celebrating a divorce? I don't know. He shrugged. I went to the sea for 2 weeks to celebrate. I just lay on the sand and matured to move on with my life. I asked about you and thought that if you like weddings so much, you should probably be married already. Maybe even more than once. Why is that? To the first impressions of the meeting, delighted surprise and even excitement, heart palpitations begin to be joined by the familiar irritation of mere déjà vu. So it's weddings. How many different ones can be played, given the opportunity and imagination? Stephen spoke in a completely serious tone, but his eyes were laughing. I'm not married and haven't been yet, Camille replied, and nervously fixed her already perfect hair. The girl now wore a bob haircut. So what do you need to do here? From the cameras lost the image of the hall. Apparently, you didn't cover it up with your fancy stuff, so put the camera somewhere else. This is a perfect angle. That's not my problem. The design's already been thought out and you can't change it. Who cares where the bows are? This is about safety. What, you're afraid of the bride being stolen? Don't worry. It's not in the script. I don't know anything. Stephen was suddenly dangerously close, literally hovering over her. With all his weight, Camille thought, inappropriately enough, that he had grown noticeably bigger or shoulders heavier. It's been 10 years, Stephen said. You haven't changed at all. Very much. The girl felt awkward, and for some reason she was sure that it was treacherous, and the blush was clearly visible, despite the tone, except Anna and powder. So what to do? One of the workers, who had a lot to do, couldn't stand it. It's scheduled for this day. Camille and Stephen backed away, just bounced off each other, as if to scare them off. The flock of birds scattered, and soon, with Camille's instruction, the textile decor was moved so as not to block the CCTV cameras. Now it's all ready, smugly said the girl, and Stephen visibly perked up. Then we can talk. Camille wanted to say that she was terribly busy, but that would be untrue. And besides, she herself wanted to talk to the man who made her heart beat. So strange. Often, all these years, it was still hours before the wedding reception at the bride's father's mansion, and Stephen and she had agreed to sit on the back porch of the house for a little while. It was the quietest place now. They sat down directly on the steps, the English-style garden in front of them disheveled as if wild, but in fact artificially grown. Camille talked about how, after studying 2 years at university to become a philologist, she had realized that it was absolutely none of her business. And it was. Decided to take a big risk just to make a living for a while, as it turns out, and in parallel to look for herself. In the end, it turned out that she liked to create holidays, and 5 years ago, she and Evelyn created a small agency, which by now has become one of the leading agencies in the city. Evelyn. Stephen was surprised. The one whose husband's an electrician, and they have a son, Kevin. I remember her. She always treated me differently, he added, and he averted his eyes differently than the others. I know, Camille nodded. She and I were talking about you the other day, and she told me all about how you weren't a monster at all. And when you reminded me, you thought I was a monster. He squinted as if with a grudge and invited me to the cottage. I swear, I smiled menacingly. It was the most nightmarish date of my life and mine. I'd give anything to have it any other way. I mean, what kind of idiot was I, anyway? I should have just asked her out to the movies properly. I mean, you don't have to be afraid to say no. I see. The girl nervously sent a strand of hair behind her ear. The conversation had suddenly turned into a direction that was not the most convenient for a free conversation. How's your grandmother? Stephen asked. She's fine. I'm amazed at her age, and she's still chipper. Her health, of course, sometimes fails her, but she's strong enough for 10 people. You know, it's only recently that I've been able to understand her. I thought when I was just out of high school that I was out of a nightmare. And then I realized that she just loved me so much and thought it was to protect me. I spoke to the doctor. Grandma is seeing a psychologist, Camille explained. She agreed to see him to find out why she was having bad dreams. And then somehow he got her talking. And it's made our life together easier. Anyway, the psychologist doesn't want to scare her, but he said it's kind of an obsession. She was lucky she stopped in time. You know, I feel so guilty sometimes for leaving my grandmother alone for so long. But I got her a nurse, a very decent woman. She takes good care of her. Now Grandma doesn't need anything. The girl saw the skirt on her knees. She looked carefully at Stephen, catching his gaze. How long have you been divorced? Last year. I told you. We didn't see eye to eye. I guess I'm just not a good person. For some reason, I thought you'd changed since then, and not for the worse. So I don't think you're a bad Stephen. And your mother? She was careful. Do you know what's wrong with her? I mean, you didn't think of me finding her, Stephen replied. And it seemed that he was ready to answer frankly to this question, but only wanted to get off as soon as possible. We talked calmly, peacefully, and she apologized and told me not to show up again. She really has a whole other life. I don't belong there, but I forgave her. That's it. Camille fell silent. They just sat side by side and watched the wind move the tall, lush grasses and the flowers among them. I had completely forgotten. The magister exclaimed menacingly. He is a solid age for a dog of a dozen, but he is fine. Stephen smirked. He actually lives here with me. He's in the enclosure now. Do you want to say hello? He stood up and gave his hand to the girl. I do. She stood up, accepting his outstretched palm. Do you want to bet? Stephen rounded his eyes. This was something he hadn't expected at all. Terms. The master will recognize me at once, and then you'll give me a personal tour of the place. Tell me, what does the security service do? I only know from the movies. You walk around and talk to someone on the radio all the time. Yes, Stephen almost answered. And if you lose, then you can take a chance and ask me out. The young man grinned. It was a very tempting offer. And whatever the outcome of the bet, he somehow had no doubt that the date would happen, and it would be very easy to turn it into an excursion. Stephen also thought about the fact that he might just have to become a really good guy now. It was necessary to become a good husband for Camille.